Welcome to Mr. Nightspook. Tonight, in 6 true creepy encounters from isolated Alaskan villages, we journey far beyond the reach of roads and radio, into places where the sun disappears for weeks, and voices carry too far across the snow. These are chilling tales whispered by those who live on the edge of the map, where strange lights move against the frozen sky, things knock at your door with no footprints left behind, and the wind carries names that no one should still be saying. This channel is new, and my goal this month is to reach 1,000 brave subscribers. Nearly 90% of you will listen and vanish without subscribing. Don't be one of them. Hit that button now and stay with us in the dark. Before we begin, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it where you are? Because in the endless night of the Alaskan frontier, time doesn't always move the same way. Pull your blanket tight. Listen to the wind outside your window. Out here, silence isn't safety, it's a warning now. Let's begin. I never thought I'd write about this because I've spent a year telling myself it was weather and numbers and the way fear fills empty places. But I can't sleep anymore, and I'm hoping that if I lay this out like a field report, someone will either tell me I'm wrong or at least understand why I left the equipment where I did. My name doesn't matter. What matters is that last winter I took a temporary assignment in Nuvuk, the little cluster of houses at the very top of Alaska, where the wind feels like it's leaning on you and the horizon is a hard, white line. I was there to monitor aurora activity for a satellite calibration project. It sounded straightforward. Northern lights, magnetometers, all-sky cameras, a heated trailer with a generator humming through the dark months. You get flown in, you calibrate, you get flown out. Simple. That's what I told my sister Janine when she made me promise to text when I could. Don't go hiking out on the ice like those guys on YouTube, she said. You're clumsy and your toes will freeze off. I said I had no intention of hiking anywhere. I would sit indoors, drink bad coffee, and log pretty lights while listening to the VHF chatter from the harbor. I meant it when I said it. If you've never been that far north, it's hard to explain how sound changes. It's either nothing, like being buried under blankets, or it's knife sharp. The first night the power plant cycled and the wind shifted, I could hear every cable on the utility pole singing. The sky had that milky low glow you get when the moon is behind clouds and the ground catches everything. My coworker Leah met me at the little office, a plywood rectangle with a heater that rattled like someone had put bolts in a jar and taped it to the wall. She was the field tech assigned to get me oriented. She'd wintered there for 2 years and had the easy competence of someone who could fix a generator with a multi-tool and a shoelace. Rule 1, she said, showing me the equipment rack. You respect the cold. She tapped a magnetometer that wore a knitted hat like a joke. Rule 2, don't call them northern lights in front of some folks. It's the lights, or just the sky. Some people got stories. She said the last part casually like we were discussing coffee brands. I said, I like stories. She shrugged. Then you'll get one. The all-sky camera sat on a pole behind the building, its fisheye lens staring at everything. Inside, I had a workstation with a software package that logged proton flux and KP index and time-stamped each spike. It's the kind of work that rearranges your sleep schedule. You sit when you should stand and step outside when the subtle tilt of the aurora forecast tells you it's about to kick off. That first week was quiet. Green bands that moved like breath. Soft drapery ripples that made your eyes water if you stared too long because you kept expecting a sound that never came. Leah shared a thermos of coffee that tasted like burnt toast and told me which street had the best view across the sea ice. We waved to a guy named Jonah who worked for the borough and always seemed to be on a snow machine going somewhere at dangerous speed. We had background characters even in a place that small. Eileen at the little store who said the milk would come when the weather let it. A state trooper named Reno who wore an unflappable expression like it had been stitched on. A maintenance guy called Ollie who had a laugh you could hear over the wind. 3 things happened in quick succession around the end of November. The first was the pulses. I was logging baselines when I got a series of electromagnetic pulses at unusually regular intervals. Not crazy high, just wrong in their neatness like a metronome in the data. The second was the phone call Leah took in the hallway, the one where she said okay 3 times while the heater hiccuped and coughed. She came back, put the phone face down and wouldn't meet my eyes. Somebody's missing, she said. Kid. Took the dogs out and didn't come back. We both looked at our coats by reflex. It was dark in that way where even the snow looks gray. Trooper Reno drove by and the red-blue washed the wall and then he was gone. The third thing was the story I got from an elder named Anaktuvuk when I followed Leah to a community meeting at the school where people spoke quietly and kept their voices steady with effort. There was hot water in a big silver urn and kids in thick socks whispering in a corner. When it was time for me to introduce myself and explain what I did, I felt stupid talking about satellites and calibration and the smallness of wind-driven oxygen drifting into the magnetosphere. But when I finished, an old man with a face like carved wood nodded and said almost to himself, "The sky hunt's here," like he was noting a weather change. People nodded like he'd stated a fact, like ice is slippery. I laughed because I thought he was being poetic, and Leah touched my sleeve hard enough that I shut up. Later she told me, "Don't do that. If someone says something like that, you let it sit. Everyone has their own way of keeping safe." A week later, the pulses lined up. I mean that in the most literal sense. My spreadsheet was a patchwork of green numbers, and I had a column where I kept track of local incidents because the radio got boring, and you write down anything to break the monotony. Lost dogs, generator hiccups, the fuel truck late, a snow machine overturned by the school, the kid they found out on the flats where the wind had erased his tracks in hours like he'd walked into a pocket and vanished. The pulses popped up at intervals of 217, then 217 again, then 217 with a lag of 7 seconds like someone worked the pattern around a corner and bumped their elbow. I realized that the timestamps of the highest pulses corresponded with times when people were reported missing. Not just there, but in the whole borough. It wasn't exact, but it was exact enough for the hairs on my arms to stand up. When I plotted it, the line looked like someone had drawn it with a ruler. It should have been random. Weather is messy. Space is messy. Human behavior is messy. This felt deliberate. I told myself I was cherry-picking. I deleted the spreadsheet twice and then recreated it from raw logs so I wouldn't cheat. It looked the same either way. I told Leah. She stared out the window at nothing for a long beat and said, "You need to talk to Jonah. He found the kid's hat by the radar sheds." The old Dew Line radar stations were mounds under the snow by the coast, half buried with wind-scoured drifts piling against their sides like waves breaking on a ship. I'd wanted to see them, but I didn't want to be the outsider who made every local landmark into a scenic photograph. Jonah didn't seem to care about that. He shrugged into a parka that made him look like a walking sleeping bag and said, "You want to go? We can go now if you don't mind your eyelashes freezing." On the way out, Trooper Reno blocked the door with 2 fingers and said mildly, "If you see lights, you turn around. You don't follow. You don't take pictures. You don't try to figure it out, okay?" He said it like a dad asking if I'd remembered my mittens. I said okay to be polite. In the truck, Jonah adjusted the heater and said, "He's right, you know. We don't look if we can help it. We didn't make it to the radar sheds that day because the wind rose like a wall and the truck found itself in whiteout. We pulled onto a packed lot by the cannery and let the engine idle while snow hissed against the windows. The sky had no stars. The world was a closed room with the hum of diesel in your chest. And then the green came down. If you've only seen photos, you think the lights are far away, but sometimes they aren't. Sometimes they move low. I had seen that before. Curtains dragging across the horizon, but this was different. This was a filament that sank toward the ground like a rope being lowered, not directly above us, but close enough that the shapes on the snow, the drift lines and old tracks, softened in a green wash. Jonah reached over and turned off the cabin lights with an old move, like he'd done it 100 times. He didn't look at me. He looked at his hands in his lap. I don't know how to explain the feeling. You know when a dog hears a whistle you can't hear and they go still? That was what my nerves did. My ears filled with a quiet that had weight. The VHF crackled on its own. There was a sound like breath behind the truck. Jonah said softly, "We're not what it wants." And then he reached up and touched the rosary hanging from his mirror and turned the key. The engine coughed. He kept turning until it caught. We drove away slow as if speed would make it look up. I didn't put that in any log. I told myself it was St. Elmo's fire, a corona discharge along snow crystals, a trick of voltage and moisture. I told myself I had been tired, but I was also curious in the way that gets people in trouble. The way I've had since I was a kid and put a metal spoon in the microwave to see what would happen. I checked the data from the all-sky camera that night. The fisheye saw everything, and it showed the auroral arc dropping like a curtain. But there was an artifact at the edge of the frame, a thin wedge that wasn't sky. It was dark, and then it was brighter than the rest, like a shadow cast by something you couldn't see. The magnetometer chart was a neat forest of lines, and there, spaced with that same metronome neatness, sat the pulses. Leah noticed I was staying later. She started leaving post-it notes on my monitor with reminders to drink water and to go home before I forgot which way was back. She invited me to dinner at her place, where she overcooked salmon and undercooked rice, and we ate both and laughed. She told me about growing up in Nome and breaking a tooth on lake ice she tried to chew as a dare. I told her about Janine and the messages we sent back and forth where my sister asked for Aurora photos, and I sent her blurry green smears and said they were professional grade. At some point, inevitably, I told Leah about the lined-up pulses again. She listened with her hands wrapped around a mug. "I can take you out," she said finally, "not to the sheds. To the place where it's safest to stand if you're going to be stupid." We went on a night with low wind and a cloud floor that hugged the horizon. Jonah joined us because Leah asked him, and because I think he didn't want her out there with me alone. He brought a small sled with a compact car battery, a grounded rod, and a string of hand-wound antennas like a science fair project that had grown up to be serious. "For what it's worth," he said, "this is not for chasing. This is for convincing it to pass by if it notices us. People call it nonsense until it isn't. Don't be offended. Just do what we say." I wasn't offended. I was relieved. Rules are a kindness when you don't know the terrain. We parked where the sea ice met the low scrub that looked like someone had scribbled dark lines on white paper. The generator in the village purred behind us. The ocean was a black idea out there, heavy and still. We set the battery and rod in the snow, watered the connection with a thermos so the contact would be good, and ran the antennas in a crude ring, 40 feet out. Leah set up a small tripod with a GoPro and said, "It'll freeze in 10 minutes, but maybe we'll get a little. If it starts moving fast, we go, even if you think you almost have it." "Nothing is worth being right about this," I said, to be brave and not because I believed it. "Right about what?" Jonah looked toward the empty coast. "That it walks." The first hint wasn't light. It was the radio. Our handheld clicked like a Geiger counter. The clicks accelerated, then stopped, then ran backward in a clatter of tiny heartbeats. My magnetometer app, which had no right to do anything dramatic, drew a shape like someone pressing a finger against a heart monitor. Leah held up her hand. We stood still. The snow under my boots squeaked, and I felt stupidly guilty about even that sound. Then the light came, not from above but through the snow. That's the part I have not been able to explain with anything that doesn't change how I look at the ground. The surface had a skin, and beneath it something moved, and it was the color of aurora with all the yellow pulled out. It traveled like a fish under ice. It paused at the rod, went around the circle, and navigated along the gap we'd cut in the drift to set the battery. The antennas hummed soundlessly in my teeth. The GoPro lens glimmered with it, and then the cold took it, and the red light on its front died. There were voices then, but not the kind that say words. You know the way people talk in the next room with a door shut? How you can tell they're speaking, but not what. It was like that under the snow. I thought buried power lines and almost laughed, except I didn't, because Jonah, who had seen more winters there than I had birthdays, had his eyes shut and his mouth moving. Leah touched my arm and pointed not up, but beyond our circle. The green ribbon was above us now too, but it wasn't the source. It behaved like someone pulling a thread through fabric. The thing below tugged on it and it tightened, and I realized with a clarity I wish I didn't have that the low aurora was a symptom, not a cause. The sky wasn't hunting. The ground was, and the sky was its lure. If that sounds like a leap, I get it. Reading it here, it's a dramatic statement typed by someone who has convinced himself of a pattern. But then Leah's second radio, the good one clipped to her chest, spat our names. Not in any voice I knew, but in our names. Mine first, then hers. And then, like the universe wanted to taint the only thing that felt solid, Janine's. It said my sister's name in a way that got the syllables right and the breath wrong. Leah reacted faster. She said flatly, "We're leaving." Jonah didn't argue. He collapsed the antennas with fast, efficient moves like someone folding laundry while the house burns. The thing under the snow kept pace with us the way a shadow does when you have a light at your back. It stayed at the edge of the ring until Leah, without breaking stride, kicked a new line in the snow with her boot and set the coil down again. It veered. Like a deer avoiding a rope fence, it could have jumped if it had known how. The sky thread trembled and sank low enough that the ends brushed my hood and left a chemical scent like old pennies and ozone. Back in the truck, nobody spoke. The heater roared. The dashboard lights looked obscene, too bright, like we'd walked out of a funeral into a grocery store. Leah put her forehead against the steering wheel. Jonah pressed his hands between his knees and stared at the floor. After a long minute, he said, "Do you believe me now when I tell you what they say?" I didn't know what to say, but I nodded anyway. "Okay," he said. "Then when the old man says the sky hunts, you understand he is being kind. He is not saying what we think is under our feet. The words are the fence. We step around them to get where we need to go. If this were a clean story, I'd tell you that we left, the end. But I had the bad kind of curiosity, the thing that took the place of sleep. I started looking at older data, beyond our station, digging through public logs. I found a handful of reports from stations farther inland, where magnetometers hiccuped at regular intervals during cold snaps. There were local stories, of course, and I tried not to collect them like trophies. I wrote down what I could check against numbers. The pulses loved the edges of things, shorelines, places where old metal sat under snow, the buried radar mounds, the short runway that ran like a scar from the village into the white. I made a map with dots and lines, and it looked like a net thrown carelessly across a flat world. "I know you want to ask about the missing people." I asked too. I asked like a fool. And here's what I can say without turning this into something I don't have the right to tell. Sometimes they came back. I don't mean they walked in the door and said, "Ha, fooled you." I mean a hunter who knew the land like he knew his own hands, got turned around in a white night, and when they found him, he was 3 miles from where he meant to be, and he would not step inside afterward without tapping the doorframe twice every time, even when no one was looking. I mean a woman who fell asleep in the cab of her truck waiting for her husband outside the store and woke up with the engine off and the lights off and her phone dead and the kids' drawings pinned under the wipers with a wooden clothespin that didn't belong to her. People survive strange things up there because they have rules, and the rules were made by grandparents who had their own rules, and so on back. If you're reading this in a city and you think you're above superstition, I will tell you that you probably still glance at the microwave clock and say, "Just 1 more minute to the elevator," like a prayer. So why did I go back out? Ego. Anger at a thing I couldn't put on a chart. The sense that if I could prove it, name it, it would shrink. Leah saw it on me and said, "Don't." Jonah said, "If you insist, take this," and gave me a tin with a circle of copper wire inside and a packet of sand. "It's for circles," he said. "Not magic. Just a reminder that you don't go straight everywhere." I said I would be careful. I said I would only go to the edge of the flats, where the scrub gave me reference points and the horizon was less like a cliff. I told Janine I would text later. She sent me a selfie with her cat asleep on her chest and said, "Stop chasing green lady scarves and go to bed like a human for once." I took the good camera. I took the VHF. I took the coil. I took the hand auger for ice fishing because I wanted a hole. I don't know why that felt important, but it did. If the lights lived under, I wanted to give them a place to breathe. That's what I told myself. It's embarrassing to write. The wind had teeth that night. The air glittered with ice like broken glass. The sea was a low hush to my left, a mass rather than a sound. I kept the village in sight behind me until the small pale lights were coins thrown on a table. Then I stopped and set the coil and poured out the sand to mark a slow circle like the ribs of a clock. I turned off the headlamp. The world receded. The aurora overhead was a thin ribbon. The handheld radio gave a single disapproving click and went silent. You expect a big moment in stories like this. A roar, a sudden light. There wasn't one. There was a change in the snow the way a sleeping person changes position. A motion under like a ripple in a bedspread, then a small bloom of green a foot to my right, a second bloom 6 feet away. They were exploratory, tasting places where the snow was thin, mapping my circle. I remembered Jonah's borrowed words. Not magic, just a reminder you don't go straight everywhere. I kept my feet inside what I'd drawn. I set the auger and worked the handle. The sound was shockingly loud. Ice chips popped. My breath fogged and froze on my scarf. The hole took longer than I expected because the ice was thicker than I expected. When I broke through, a damp scent rose that wasn't ocean brine. It was clean, like a freezer that's never held food. The green moved toward the circle's edge. The handheld murmured my name in my sister's voice, and I said out loud to the empty night, "Not today." And then something tried to step on my shadow. That is the closest I can come. The ground shifted under the weight of a thing that wasn't weight. The green gathered at the circle like steam at the lid of a pot. I felt pressure build behind my teeth, a migraine coming on with a weather front. I dropped the camera because suddenly it felt like the worst kind of idea. The aurora above knotted itself, a stitch pulled tight. There was a shape within the light. Not a body, not a figure, nothing that would look like a monster if you sketched it, but a pattern the brain would love to assign edges to if it had more time. It bent toward the circle. I felt childish, stubborn anger at the way it knew my voice and my sister's name and my curiosity. I said, "I see you," and I lifted my foot and nudged the coil with my boot and opened the circle a hair. The green slipped in like a draft through a cracked door. I'm not going to tell you there was a face. There wasn't. There was a sense the way you know when someone has entered a room behind you and is deciding whether to speak. I had the unpleasant feeling of being measured against a scale that wasn't made for humans. I also had the feeling of standing in a doorway I didn't mean to open, and behind it was a hallway, and behind that something that had been using the sky as a hand puppet for a long time. The radio spoke again. This time it used Leah's voice and said clearly, "Turn around." So I did, because there are rules, and one of them is that you go when someone you trust says to go, even if it comes out of a box and a voice borrowed from a friend. I stepped carefully back along my own tracks. The green tested the old footprints and then avoided them, which shook me more than anything else because it meant learning or at least attention. I picked up the camera, which had kept recording until the cold made the battery slump and die. I felt one more brush along my boots and I swear it had intention in it. Not malice exactly, but an appetite that thought I might be food and then decided I was all bone and bad taste. The aurora ribbon rose with me, drawing thread back through fabric. Above the horizon, a pale pink started to show you get sometimes before the sun considers returning. A false sunrise that tricks birds. The village lights were close enough to count. When I reached the tracks from the truck that morning, my lungs hurt and my eyelashes were crusted with ice, and the radio said my name one more time in a stranger's voice I have never heard before or since. Leah met me at the door with her jaw set. She didn't say, "I told you so." She said, "Do you have the coil?" I handed her what was left of it. The wire had a black smear along one bend like it had been held over a candle. Jonah came from the back with 2 mugs and set them on the desk. He looked at my face and then put a 3rd mug down too. Trooper Reno knocked twice on the frame with his knuckles and then stood in the hall like he didn't intend to come in properly. "You good?" he asked, and it wasn't rhetorical. I nodded and then, because once I start I don't know when to stop, I told them about the hole and the shape that wasn't, and the way it moved around the circle like it could smell fence. Leah listened with her eyes closed. Jonah said, "Okay," the way people say it when something fits a slot in their head they made a long time ago. Reno looked out the window like he was checking the weather for me, even though it was still the same long night. We looked at the footage later. There wasn't much after the lens fogged, just a green smear and the sound of auger teeth in my breath. But at the beginning, when I was panning, there is a moment where the edge of the circle catches and a soft, thin tendril of light moves not down but sideways and then dips and then retracts, like a feeler. It could be artifact. It could be nothing. I have told myself that every day since. I wrote up an internal note to my supervisor that said, "Instrumentation anomaly tied to atmospheric conditions," which is both a lie and a truth. The project got what it needed. The satellites don't care about what people say in a school gym. I stayed another month because leaving right then would have felt like running, and I am stubborn about appearances in stupid ways. Since I came back south, I've had the same dream 3 times. In it, I'm back on the flats. Only the snow is gone and everything is gray grit and salt, and I can see the old radar domes laid open like the halves of a seed pod. The sky is white like a blank page. There's no aurora. There's the sense of a thing the size of a town laying just under the dirt like a cat under a blanket, patient and amused. In the dream, I have the coil in the sand and I draw the circle, and then I forget which side of the line I'm on. I step and I don't know if I stepped into safety or out of it, and then I hear a radio click behind me and a voice that is almost my sister's, and almost Leah's and almost mine, saying a single word I can't remember when I wake up. When it's really late, when the house is quiet and the clock sounds like it's chewing, I think I hear a faint hum through the floor. Not pipes, not neighbors. A tone like the beginning of a song, you know, from somewhere and can't place. I moved my bed away from the window 2 nights ago because the light from the street, throws a shape on the wall that looks like someone standing there with their head tilted, listening. Last week, Janine sent me a video of the aurora from her porch in Fairbanks and wrote, "She's dancing tonight." I watched it and felt a twist low in my stomach because the pillars in her video weren't falling. They were rising, and I wanted to call her and say, "If you're outside and the radio calls your name even as a joke, you go inside." I don't want to be the person who tells other people how to be afraid, though. I don't want to be the person with a string of rules nobody asked for. I left my field notebook on the shelf by the door when I came home. 2 days later, I found it on the coffee table open to the page with the pulses lined up. And for a long time, I stood there trying to remember if I had taken it down and forgotten. Maybe I did. I'm not saying I didn't. I've started leaving my phone on the dresser at night because once around 3 in the morning it lit up with a call from a number that was only zeros. When I answered, all I heard was a soft, long exhale, like someone outside a door deciding whether to knock. The point of saying all this, if there even is a point, is not to get you to believe in anything. It's to tell you that there are places where the sky tells a story you think you understand, and you may be looking at the wrong narrator. If you ever find yourself on a night when the green comes down close enough to touch and the radios start saying names they shouldn't, and you think about taking one more step for a better view or a better video, draw a circle in your head even if you don't have a coil, step in it or out of it. I can't tell you which is better. I still don't know which side I was on. All I know is that the lights over Nuvuk weren't falling from the sky the night they found me, and pressed along my boots like fog with a memory. They were rising from below, polite as hands on a railing, as if what was under the snow had merely been waiting for someone to stand still long enough to be counted. And lately, when the fridge hums and the streetlight flickers and the radio on my shelf gives that single click, like a pin tapping glass, I catch myself holding my breath and listening for footsteps that aren't there yet but might be if I open the door. I don't care if anyone believes me. Writing this down feels like putting weight on a shelf that's been sagging for too long. Maybe if I arrange it carefully, the shelf won't break. I'm a mom, a substitute teacher, and I used to be the kind of person who'd tell you there's an explanation for everything if you look hard enough. This happened 2 winters ago in Tununak, Alaska, and I've run out of explanations that don't keep me up at night. I took the job because I needed a change and because money doesn't care about grief. My husband Eli died the previous spring. Heart thing, sudden and ordinary in the worst way, like a door that shuts while you're still talking. Our daughter Maya was 7. I'd been doing odd sub-gigs around Anchorage, but when the position in Tununak came up, a winter-long coverage for a teacher going outside for surgery, I said yes, mostly out of stubbornness. I wanted to prove I could keep everything moving. You do weird things when you're trying to outrun a quiet house. Tununak sits on a low shore where the land meets ocean, and then winter swallows the line between them. The village sprawls along raised boardwalks so you're walking above the tundra and snow, and the houses, boxes of weathered wood with bright paint peeling on the windward sides, stand on stilts. There are sled dogs and snow machines parked under stairwells, stacks of fishing gear like frozen sculptures, smoke from oil stoves drifting flat in the wind. The school is a rectangle of yellow with a blue roof that always looks rimed with salt. People move in pairs there, leaning into the weather, shoulders hunched, eyes half closed from the wind carving up off the water. The first few days were all logistics. The main generator hiccuped, the backup kicked in, and everyone shrugged because that's the rhythm. Maya and I learned to time our showers with the warmest hours. The village store had hours posted in careful black marker, but opened whenever the owner's cousin finished shoveling the steps. My neighbor on the right, Alice, had a laugh like a bell and dropped off a casserole dish of salmon and rice the first night. My neighbor on the left, a soft-spoken maintenance guy named Noah, showed me where the breaker switches were, the VHF radio channel to reach the school principal in Bethel, and how to wedge a strip of cardboard under the back door in high wind so it didn't rattle like a mad thing. He had the kind of patience that makes you think he could fix anything with his hands and a piece of wire. Maya made friends faster than I did. Kids are like that. They find the gaps and slip through. She walked the boardwalk to school wrapped in a neon scarf my sister had knitted and came home with stories about sledding off a plank, ramp they called the tail, and about 2 older girls who talked in their own code and pretended to be weather forecasters at recess. I taught a mixed group of 1st through 3rd graders in the morning and 4th through 6th in the afternoon. I learned their names: John, Flora, Micah, Kiana, Pete, and the way each one tilted their head when they thought hard. I learned how the light came late and left early, and how the whole building groaned when storms pushed the ice against the shore. The first weird moment was a drawing. I was collecting Crayola smears and pencil forest from the younger group for a winter scenes wall when I found a page that made me frown without knowing why. It was from a boy named Amos in 3rd grade. He was quiet, the kind of kid who took 2 extra seconds before answering and always noticed who had dropped their hat. His picture showed a house split open like a dollhouse with a little stick figure woman inside stirring a pot on a stove. Outside the house were tall black shapes with no faces, just a smudge where a face should be, gathered near the window and the door. The sky was all gray scribbles. Along the bottom he'd written careful block letters, "Do not let it inside." I stuck it to the wall like the rest, but I kept thinking about the smudge where a face should be. That afternoon, when the older kids worked on a writing prompt about their favorite winter memory, I mentioned Amos's drawing. "That's a good composition," I said, because teachers narrate everything. Amos used contrast. "What are those figures? Snow machines, trees?" A girl named Ruth shook her head and didn't look up from her paper. "The knocker," she said. It was the way you say the name of a teacher or a cousin, not a monster. The room paused around the scratch of pencils. I glanced up and everyone had that small stillness that comes when too many people agree not to meet your eyes. "I haven't heard that one yet," I said. "Is the knocker a story you tell?" Pete, who darted everywhere like a sparrow, shrugged. "It knocks after midnight when it snows. It just wants to come in. And you don't let it," Ruth added, flipping a page. Kiana drew little spirals in her margin and said nothing. On the walk home, with my hood up and my breath blooming white in front of me, I asked Maya if she'd heard anything about a knocker. She pulled on my sleeve to get over a drift. "Yeah," she said. "Micah told me. He said his uncle heard it last winter. He said you gotta be quiet. If you say who you are, it uses your name to come inside. But if it already knows your name, that means someone told it and that someone is bad." I told her it was just a story. I said lore because that word makes stories sound like they live in museums. Maya nodded with that expression kids have, like humoring you is an act of love. Storms rolled in. The horizon became a suggestion. The village shrank to a handful of lights set into white. We had a week then where the power went out every night around the same time, sometimes for an hour, sometimes 3. We made a ritual of it. Maya and I would light the candle on the kitchen counter, the one in a jelly jar with Berry Jam 2009 scratched onto the lid, and stack playing cards into houses while the house ticked as it cooled. In darkness, the oil stove was a throat that never cleared. The wind made everything into a drum or a flute. We slept with our hats on and our boots by the door. I started hearing it the second week. You know how normal things become strange because you're waiting for strange things? A threat changes the shape of your days even if it never comes. It was nothing big at first. A sound like a finger gently tapping the window near the sink. The first time I paused with my hands in the dishwater and looked over my shoulder. No silhouette, no quick shadow. I told myself it was ice settling. A branch, though there are no trees in Tununak, so maybe a loose wire in the wind. A bit of Eve hitting the siding. That night, when Maya had fallen asleep with a book about sled dogs open on her chest, I heard it again. Not the window this time, the door. 3 quick taps, then a slower fourth, then the tiniest pause before 2 more. Something in the sequence tugged at me. It was familiar in a way that made my scalp tighten. I couldn't place it and I didn't open it. The clock on the microwave on power that night read 12:17 a.m. When I told myself later that it was a prank, I meant it. Kids play games. They dare each other. But in Tununak, nobody wasted movement in cold if it could be helped. And nobody went house to house after midnight without a reason. The next morning, I pulled the door open and looked down the steps at the drifted snow. The wind had smoothed it like frosting. No footprints, not even a dog's track. I told myself snow fills in. The wind erases. That afternoon, during quiet reading time, I walked the aisles between desks and saw it again in their drawings. Not just Amos, little charcoal columns near windows. A hand, or an idea of a hand, pressed against glass. One picture had it touching the front door, and the child had drawn the indentations the way you'd draw the pressure of a handprint in Play-Doh. An oval palm, 5 long fingers, a 6th little vein of graphite trailing off where the edge of the page cut it. I didn't put that one on the wall. I finally asked Noah. He was working on the generator that evening, and I brought him coffee in a mug with a chipped rim. He took it from me like he was grateful for the heat more than the caffeine, rubbing his bare hands against the ceramic. He had a seal parka on and snow flaked down onto his lashes. The sky was that bruised blue that means more weather is coming. Kids have been drawing these things, I said. Faceless people at windows. They call it the knocker. He swallowed and looked at the school, then at my house down the boardwalk, then out toward the ice. Old story, he said finally. Not just here. My grandma said the thing knocks when there's a death on the ice, someone not buried right, or when you take something that isn't yours. People give it different reasons. Same rule, though. Don't let it in, I said. I made it a joke because the alternative was to make it a prayer. He didn't smile. Don't talk to it. Don't say your name. Don't answer questions. If it calls someone in your house, don't answer. Don't even think the answer. It learns you. My cousin's place last year? He said it knocked like a raven pecking. He used a broom handle to bang back loud to scare it. My aunt said you never tell it can leave. That's a kind of yes. You just let it be nothing. What if it gets persistent? Then you get louder inside. Play music. Make a mess with noise. If you're boring, it goes. We laughed a little at that, and the laughter fogged out into nothing. I told him I was probably being silly, and he told me being silly is free and being wrong can cost you. He had a way of saying things that sounded like they'd always been true. Maya coughed in her room, a soft sound, normal. It broke the shape of the moment. I took my hand off the knob like it had burned me. I stepped back slow, like disengaging from a bee's nest. There was a long quiet. I thought, please go. Please take the patience that isn't mine and go. Finally, it knocked once. One short, precise knock that sounded exactly like the rhythm Eli used to use on our apartment door, when he forgot his keys and wanted me to come let him in. The muscle memory of opening for him almost moved me like a puppet. I slept in the hallway that night, a blanket around my shoulders, my back against Maya's door. I woke up stiff and creased and old. In the morning, the snow at the bottom of the steps held the shape of a knee this time. A small dent, and farther out on the boardwalk, a scattered peppering like someone had taken a handful of pebbles and pressed them gently just so, and lifted them again. The sky was white and the water was ice, and something underneath all that moved, because movement is what this world does and stopping is rare. I told the principal in Bethel that I was worried about a prankster. He said the village safety officer would swing by that night if the weather allowed. I asked Noah to check the locks. He did, and he found nothing wrong except a little splintering where the deadbolt met the jamb that could have been there before. He said, could have been the first day I chose to see the world in a new way. Alice left me her rosary and told me to return it when the sun came back properly. That night before midnight, someone knocked at Alice's instead. 2 quick taps, a pause, then nothing. Later, she told me she didn't move or breathe for 10 minutes, and when she finally exhaled, she heard her own name without a voice saying it. She slept at her sister's the night after. The village safety officer did swing by, his snow machine idle under my steps long enough to make a hole of warm air in the drift. He knocked on my door at 10 and I let him in, and he took a report with gloved hands. He asked for a description and I said nothing, and he nodded like that was the description a lot of people gave. When he left, the house felt smaller, not because he'd taken space with him, but because the promise of help had widened things for a moment and then returned them to their previous size. On the 5th night of this, a storm came in mean. The wind made the house a part of the weather instead of a place apart from it. The generator kept hiccuping. The radio was a smear of static and half songs. I put Maya to bed in my room. I told her we were camping. I told her a story about a moose who wanted to be a whale. And I broke my own rule and put the bathroom mirror in the cabinet like it was something sharp a kid could grab. We fell asleep early from the noise. I dreamed about Eli under the hood of our car, tapping the wrench to settle the socket onto the bolt. That little rhythm that meant he was thinking. I woke to quiet. We both did. You know how your kid's breath changes and you wake because something in you always watches? The quiet was like someone had turned down the world with a knob. The storm had stopped mid-sentence. My ears rang from the absence of it. In that wide, muffled space, I heard the first knock. Gentle, the second. Gentle. The third, fourth, pause, fifth, sixth. I didn't move. I knew if I did, every fiber in my body would want to turn the lock and let the absence of wind fill itself with something else. Beck. The house breathed. It came from the wood, from the nails, from the thin space between window and frame. And then, this is the part I have only told twice before, and both times I watched people's faces and wanted to give them a way out, and I couldn't. Then I heard Maya's voice. Not a whisper from the bed, a whisper from the other side of the door. "Mom, I can't sleep. Can you let me in?" Both of us were in the bed. Maya's head was a warm weight on my arm. I could feel her hair against my wrist. She twitched the way kids do when they're halfway through a dream about running. But if you've ever heard your child's voice in distress, you know there's a part of you that rises to it like a fish to light. My legs took me to the door without my permission. My hand hovered. The lock sat there like the smallest decision you could make that would change everything. "Mom?" the voice said again, a little urgent, and then a small sound like a heel scraping wood, the way Maya drags her feet when she's resisting bedtime. Behind me, the real Maya made a soft sound and tucked her knees up. I stood very still. I pressed my free hand against my throat and felt my pulse like a knock from inside. I wanted to say something that would break whatever this was. But every rule the village had given me was silence. Don't name. Don't answer. Don't let it know it's real. I swallowed my child's name until it hurt. The door had a seam of light under it from the street lamp that sometimes worked when frost wasn't crusted over its face. The seam of light narrowed like something outside leaned close enough to eclipse it. The knock came one more time, single and soft, and then, so close I could feel my own breath push against the wood and bounce back. I heard Eli's voice, the way it sounds when you say a thing you've said 100 times without thinking. "Hey love, open up." I forgot my keys. That line had once been the funniest thing about him because he never remembered his keys and we teased him about it, and he adored being teased. It was an ordinary line that carried a life inside it. I put my hand on the lock. On the bed, Maya turned over and made a little snore like a kitten. The house counted my breaths out loud. 1, 2, 3. There are choices that look like actions and there are choices that look like stillness. I stood there with my hand on the lock until my fingers went numb. I stood there until something outside sighed like it was bored. I stood there until the seam of light widened again. I stood there until I could back away without feeling like I was pulling something in with me. I lay down with my daughter and felt every muscle in my back hold me off the mattress by a hair. In the morning, the snow at the bottom of the steps was smooth as a new page. On the boardwalk, there was a single line drawn with a fingertip from my house to the school and past it, out toward the flats, where the wind had erased it into a general brightness. If I were making this story neat, I would tell you it ended there, that I closed some metaphorical window and the thing lost my scent and never came back. But neat stories are for after-dinner television, not for nights that last longer than they should. I finished out the winter. We took a charter when the weather broke. I left Alice's rosary in her mailbox with a note that said thank you in big messy letters. Noah hugged Maya and patted my shoulder like a brother would. At the airport in Bethel, I listened to a woman argue about baggage fees and a boy ask for Skittles, and I felt like I'd carried an invisible backpack full of stones a long way. And now finally someone might take it off me and say, "Hey, you shouldn't have had to wear that." No one did, of course. Isn't that the sound of adulthood? Waiting for someone to notice your burden and realizing everyone else's hands are full? At home, I told myself I'd left it behind. But sometimes, when the house is too quiet and the weather in Anchorage is right for the hollow sound of plows at 3 a.m., I hear the shape of a knock inside the shape of another sound. It's polite always, never more than a breath against the door. I've changed locks. I've moved furniture. I've put the mirror in the hallway and left it there and put it back again and told myself, I'm not playing the game if I don't know the rules. I have so many playlists I can't remember which ones I made to drown out silence and which ones I made because Maya likes to dance. Last week, I was washing a mug, white with a blue scratch across the side like a horizon, and I heard that rhythm on the counter without hearing it. 3 quick, 1 slow, pause, 2. It was just a drop of water slipping from the faucet to the metal. It was just my heart in my fingers. It was just the house settling. The mug knocked the lip of the sink when I set it down, gentle like someone asking to be let in. I stood there with dishwater creeping up my sleeves and said nothing out loud and everything I could in the part of me that thinks you can think a thing hard enough to make it true. In the morning, my daughter asked if I'd been up late. I said yes, I'd been reading. She said she thought she heard a tap in her dream and then forgot it. I almost told her a joke. I almost told her a lie. Instead, I said we should go for a walk after dinner, weather permitting. She grinned and said only if we get hot chocolate after. I said yes before the sentence was finished. That night, while she brushed her teeth and sang the part of a pop song that's just syllables, I stood in the hallway and looked at the front door. The seam of light under it was steady. I pressed my palm against the wood, saying nothing with my mouth and everything with my bones. My hand left no mark. The wood was just wood, somewhere in a place where the map of the world turns white. Winter was making its long breathing sound. Somewhere, a house on stilts creaked with the weight of patience. When I finally went to bed, I left the lock turned and a broom propped near the door, a habit I haven't shaken. You can call it superstition. You can call it closing a window you can't find. I can't give you proof that fits in your hand like a photograph. I can only tell you I am careful now about what I answer, even in my head. I am careful how I hear my name. I am careful with the words you use every day when you love someone, and forget to notice the rhythm you tap when you're thinking. The fourth night it knocked at 12:17 again. That same rhythm, 3 quick, 1 slow, pause 2. We had the radio on low because Maya liked falling asleep to a station out of Bethel if the wind was right. Sometimes we got static and a DJ with a soft voice reading Swap and Shop classifieds. I turned the radio up. I didn't go to the door. When I went to brush my teeth, it knocked on the bathroom window. Just a gentle touch like the tip of a finger pressed to the glass while you're daydreaming and don't know you're tapping. I stared at the frosted little oval for a long time. My heartbeat felt too large for my body. I told myself I'd set an alarm for midnight and catch whatever kid was knocking. I did it. The alarm dragged me up from a thick woolen sleep. I left the light off. I sat in the kitchen with my coat draped over my shoulders and my boots unlaced, feeling the house creak. At 12:17, steady as a kitchen timer, it came. 3, 1, pause, 2. I stood, walked to the door, and pressed my ear to the wood. The knocks weren't heavy. They were respectful, you might say. A polite tap, the way you'd try not to wake a baby. Every muscle in my neck pulled tight. I thought of the rule, don't talk, and I obeyed it. But my body did a different thing. Without meaning to, I tapped back. I don't know why. I matched it, 3, 1, pause, 2. As soon as my knuckle left the wood, I felt stupid in a very specific way. Like you feel when you realize you've used the wrong person's name and can't catch the sound back out of the air. There was silence, and then softly, like breath fogging a window, I heard my name. Not spoken. That's the part I don't know how to explain without sounding like I'm dressing it up to be dramatic. It was like the house thought it, and because I was touching the door, my bones heard it. A shape of sound that had my name sitting inside it. Not my formal name, not Rebecca. The name only Eli ever used. Beck. I stepped back so fast I cracked my heel on the step stool. The sound of my boot against the stool rang like a bell. Maya's bedroom door opened and she peered out, hair flattened on one side, eyes bright with night. Mom? I shook my head hard, the kind of small panicked motion that means don't speak. She took in the way I held myself and did what kids do when they understand fear before they understand danger. She backed up, slow, and closed her door. She walked to her bed in tiny, deliberate steps that made no sound. I love her for that even now. The next morning, the snow outside the door had a pressed shape in it. No footprints. Nothing that came and went. Just a neat, shallow depression the size of a hand. As if someone had leaned on the drift with their palm and then lifted it away. You know how snow holds shape for a bit before wind erases it? It was like that. Except there were 4 of them in a row, evenly spaced up the steps, and the lowest one on the boardwalk itself was upside down, like something reaching up from underneath had held the last plank, pushing against it to stand. I didn't tell the kids that part. I didn't even tell Noah. I brushed snow back into the prints with the furred end of my mitten and felt dumb and superstitious. At school, I was extra enthusiastic. We made paper snowflakes and did a whole thing about condensation and states of matter, and I drink too much coffee when I'm pretending not to be afraid, so my hands shook by the time I got to long division. During lunch, Ruth told me in that same casual voice that you had to cover your mirrors at night when the knocker came, because it liked to see itself learn your face, and then it could be you. I don't have many mirrors, I said, and the lie stung. There was Eli's square mirror from his tool bench in our bathroom. He used to shave on weekends when he didn't have to rush, humming, tapping the razor with that unconscious rhythm he had. 3 quick taps on the sink, 1 slow, pause, 2. That's when the pattern clicked into place for me like a lock turning. I went into the staff bathroom, leaned my head against the paper towel dispenser and swallowed the sting in my throat until it went past my heart, and I could breathe again. I called my sister that evening. She's in Portland and sleeps like a soldier, so catching her awake for a real talk is a bit of choreography. I told her I was fine and Maya was fine and we were both tired, and I said fast that a village story had got into my head and I was hearing knocks at night that sounded like Eli, and now I sounded like someone using a ghost to talk about how much they miss someone. She listened the way she always has, with little hums so you know she's there. You're in a place with weather like a racket and you sleep odd hours, she said. Grief's like an open window. You can't help what blows in. Close the window for a bit. I said I didn't know how to close a window you can't find. She said put on a playlist Eli never would have chosen. Pop songs, anything that will stomp on that rhythm. She said, call the principal in Bethel if I needed the village safety officer to do a drive-by, though there's no road to drive on. She offered to fly up if the weather allowed. And we both knew that was a sentence shaped like hope, not a plan shaped like reality. We said I love you. We hung up, I put on music. I put a towel over the bathroom mirror even though it made me feel like I was acting out a role in a play I didn't audition for. I told Maya we were having a dance party and we stomped like the house needed shaking. Together we made noise. We banged wooden spoons on a pot and laughed until we couldn't tell the difference between laughter that releases and laughter that hides. At 12:17 the knock came all the same. It was patient and small. It waited out uptown funk like a cat watching a bird. When I went to turn the volume down, because you can't keep a child asleep with your walls behaving like speakers, the knock moved to the living room window. Just a tap. The softest, hey, then the bathroom window. Then the back door near the oil drum where the wind made a low moan even on quiet nights. The music kept time with the sharp beats of my heart. I thought about what Noah said, if you're boring, it goes, and realized I didn't know how to be boring to something that had learned my name. The next morning, I invited Alice over for coffee under the pretext of bartering for sugar. Her cheeks were wind-burnt and she brought a Tupperware of fry bread she said she'd made too much of. She warmed the bread on the stove, turned it with her fingers like they didn't feel heat anymore, and told me her nephew shot a fox that had gone wrong last winter. Her tone didn't invite questions about what wrong meant. The conversation turned naturally, the way water will always find downhill, to me saying lightly, like telling a joke at the far end of a wake, what do you do when the knocker comes? She didn't laugh. I sleep by my sister's, that's cheating. I leave a radio on. I put a broom by the door so I remember not to open it. I put my rosary in my pocket. Does it work? She thought. It doesn't make it worse. That night the wind died and with it the house noises that kept me company. Silence is a shape and that shape fit poorly. We did our routine. Maya insisted on sleeping with her head under the blankets like a turtle. I sat on the couch with a book I didn't read and the lamp at my shoulder making a warm circle of light. The clock did what clocks do. At 12:17 the door gave a tiny shiver. The knock didn't come immediately. Instead, something pressed against the door so gently it made the cardboard wedge under the back door sigh. It was like someone leaning in to hear a secret through the wood. The first knock was less a sound than a question mark. It traced the rhythm in reverse, 2, pause, 1, slow, 3, quick. It wanted me to correct it. My mouth filled with the taste of pennies. My hands did a stupid thing. They reached for the deadbolt. The streak of my hand across the brass left a smear that was mine, and in the smear I saw the reflection of my own face, lined with sleep, eyes too large, hair smashed sideways. I heard it again, not a voice but a pressure. Beck, the invisible shape of my name in a sound that touched bones. And then, clear as a doorbell, a new sound, Maya whispering, "Daddy?" She hadn't left her room. Later I checked her posture in her bed, the way one hand stuck out of the blankets like a question. But I heard her whisper, a pure ache of a word. I was as still as it's possible for a person to be. Something tapped the window 2 rooms away, then the other one, then the bathroom mirror without touching it. Just the suggestion of tapping I heard in my own teeth. It mapped the house. It found the places we lived. When it touched the picture frame above the couch, the one photo I brought that wasn't of Maya, a picture of Eli standing beside our old Subaru with grease on his forearms, and that grin like he'd won a game nobody else knew they were playing. The frame tilted slightly against the nail, and then righted. as if someone had set it straight. I heard a snow machine in the distance then, the engine a steady growl that moved along the boardwalk like a shrug traveling a big body. A headlight smudged the wall for a breath. The sound grew, passed, diminished. The knock came soft again. The shape of my name put its hands on my shoulders. The door was just wood and a latch made in a factory somewhere the knocker would never see. I stood there like I'd stand in the backyard when Eli was still alive, watching him fix something, waiting for him to ask me to hand him the right wrench, listening for the taps he'd make to settle his focus. I don't know if the thing that knocks at Tununak learned me or if I learned it. Maybe that's the same thing. Maybe that's the part that matters. If you live in a place where winter eats the edges of the world and you hear a sound on the other side of your door at a time of night when no one should be out, be boring. Be silent. Let it leave without being told to, if you can. If you can't, if you reach for the lock because love makes puppets of our hands, don't listen for voices. Listen for the spaces between. In the spaces, I now hear the rest of my life. And sometimes it sounds like footsteps moving down a boardwalk toward the water. And sometimes it sounds like footsteps coming back. I was the kind of person who argues with the weather radio. The kind who corrects fishermen about tides and swears by the second cup of midnight coffee. That probably tells you I don't buy into ghost stories. I've worked nights since I was 18. Warehouse, hospital security, a cannery for a season, and for the last few years, night watch on a logging sort yard out by Port Protection, Alaska. My eyes are trained for practical things. Loose straps, shifting stacks, a light left on that shouldn't be, a skiff nudging where it isn't tied. What I'm about to describe has nothing to do with any of that. And I'm posting it here because if I say it out loud to the people I know, it'll just be a story. Here, maybe it stays closer to the thing itself. Port Protection is hardly a port. It's a cluster of houses on stilts, smoke-gray water and winter fog that sets in like a stubborn old dog. The sort yard sits off a barge-accessible inlet, a wide railless platform of creosote timbers and steel cable, with a small shack where I clock in and sit with a propane heater gnawing at the damp. The Tongass presses in on all sides, cedar and spruce so old the bark looks like scales. I used to walk the perimeter at night, between the halogen poles that threw cold cones onto the slick planks. And I could tell you by memory where the knots in the boards would catch your boot, where the nails pushed up after a hard freeze. I knew the yard like a room in my own house. It still didn't help. We'd had a late run that week, bundles of logs pushed from upriver and chained at the dock for an early morning tug. The company had pushed closer to the shoreline than the locals liked. People muttered at the bar about buffers and maps and how lines on paper are different from lines in the real world. My sister May, who runs the little store with the coffee counter where half the town passes through every day, told me I looked tired. "Be careful down there," she said. "Sonny from the fuel dock says birds are acting weird. Ravens going quiet. That means something's off." I told her birds went quiet for storms, for eagles, for no good reason. I made a joke about the ravens finally running out of gossip. She pushed a muffin at me and didn't laugh. That night, fog took the inlet by dark. The off-season always had that deep quiet where the loudest sound is your own boot soles and the heater's hiss. I did my rounds. I checked the cable locks. The logs were black and wet and huge, their bark sloughing off in long, damp strips like tired skin. The tide was falling. You could hear it rubbing the strands below the platform. A low, steady suck. I clicked my flashlight into the trees where the yard light didn't reach and saw what I always saw: crowns and shadow. On my third round, near midnight, I noticed something down by the ramp where the platform slopes to the skiff tie-ups. At first, it just looked like piled driftwood, the kind that stacks up after a southeast wind, gray and bleached, knotted roots like sculptures. But it was shaped wrong, not a tangle, vertical. Like someone had pressed sticks and roots together and stood them up like a person. It had the shoulder shape, the head shape where branches met, and something like arms. It was about my height, maybe taller. I walked down with the radio pressed to my shoulder because the fog was so dense I lost the yard lights in 20 steps, leaving me with flashlight cone and the sour creek smell that rides in on a falling tide. The thing stood just at the waterline, little wavelets tapping its base, driftweed frilled around its feet. Driftwood, sure, but it wasn't splayed. It was gathered, it felt arranged. I nudged it with my boot. It rocked but didn't collapse. In the light, I could see lengths of eelgrass knotted through its middle like a belt. Its head was a burl as big as a basketball, hollowed by rot in the center so the light made a darker hole like a mouth. The weirdest part was the smell. It didn't smell like dry wood or even wet wood. It smelled alive, dark and green with an undertone like mushrooms. You smell that all the time in the forest, but it lives in a different category when it stands up looking almost like you. I told myself some teenagers had done a joke, except we don't have teenagers who walk that far at night in winter fog for a punchline. I told myself it washed up that way. Things assemble themselves into suggestive shapes all the time. I took 5 pictures with my phone, and because I could picture guys at the bar laughing if I said I got spooked by driftwood, I braced my boot against it and pushed. It toppled with a clack and a soft hiss when water rushed over it. I kicked it apart like I was proving something to someone, and a slug the length of my hand slid out of the tumble and back into the water with a little plop. I felt stupid for how fast that made me step back. I finished my rounds. I went home to the little rental on the hill with the porch light that flickers when you slam the door. My friend Jared crashed on my couch most weekends when he made supply runs. He snored like a chainsaw. He was there that night, sprawled on his stomach, boots off and one sock still on as if he'd been too tired to finish the job. I stepped over him and went to pee. It was when I was washing my hands I noticed the smell again. The dark green wet mushroom smell, alive as breath. It felt like I was standing in a hollow log. When I came out, there were footprints on the floor. They weren't shoe prints. They weren't bare feet. They were wet marks, thin and long like someone had pressed a bundle of fingers or sticks into the wood and lifted them away. They started at the door, inside the door, and ran across the room to the kitchen, then back toward the couch, then toward the bedroom hall. I stood there dripping on the floor mat, listening for anything that would justify what I saw. Hot water pipes. The fridge, wind, Jared snored. There was nothing else. I told myself I'd just tracked in water and it spread into weird shapes. That worked until I realized the marks crossed the dry runner rug and kept their shape. They went into the hall. My bedroom door was cracked. I reached it and nudged it open with a knuckle. Dark. The thin curtains breathed with my outside door opening and closing earlier. On the floor, in the smear of light from the window, there were little islands of wetness that had dried around the edges like the bottom of a soda glass when you set it down and pick it up again. The smell was stronger here, and there was something else, softer than the heater and closer than the wind. A faint, dry crackle, the kind of sound you hear inside a wood stove before a log shifts. In the morning, I checked the photos on my phone to see the driftwood thing again and maybe laugh at myself. But the pictures were black. Not all black. The timestamp and the battery icon showed. But the center where the shape had been was dark, like the exposure went crazy. I could drag over and see the halogen lights in my boot. But the center was nothing. I put the phone then face down on the table without looking too long at the black square I'd made. "Man," Jared said when he woke up, rolling onto his back and wiping his face. "Did you leave a window open?" "It's damp like a dog in here." He sniffed and made a face. "Smells like the time we moved that stump off the dock and it had those white worms in it." "You were sawing your boots off the other night," I said. "Maybe it's you." "I was what?" "Never mind." We loaded crates in his skiff and I got through another day by telling myself how stupid it was to be bothered by the smell of wood. During my shift, I found another one. This time by the old pilings where the original dock had rotted away. It was smaller, child height. Someone had tucked a length of orange rope through its middle, a castaway from a crab pot, and the free end dragged in the water like a leash. When the wind shifted, it turned and faced the yard with that same burl mouth open to nothing. I stood and watched it long enough for the fog to beat on my eyebrows. I didn't kick this one. I couldn't shake the thought I was being watched. The yard felt different, not loud or even quiet, but crowded with a presence I couldn't pin. I tried to radio Carla, my boss, to say something dumb that would get her talking and anchor me in normal. The radio cracked and gave me a wash of static like the old AM would when a logging truck rolled by. I went into the shack and sat with the heater roaring. The smell came into the room like a tide under the door. If you've never had the sensation of being on land and feeling like you're about to float away, it's strange. Your inner ear says steady, but something else says your feet are standing on skin. I turned the heater up and it only made it worse. Heat brought more smell. Around dawn, the fog thinned to a gray that separated itself into trees and river mouth and the line where the bar should have been. You could see the driftwood people. 3 now, 1 near the ramp. One by the pilings, one farther out exactly at the tide line facing inland. No footprints, obviously, because there was no sand here. Only slats of wood and slick muddy rock and water that rose and erased itself. The tide lapped their ankles. They didn't move. That's the other thing I have to say. There was never a moment I saw them step. I only ever saw them here, then later there. The way you learn a person's route in the background of your week. A shape at the corner of your vision that becomes a point on your map. Locals noticed. Old Ruth, who runs the laundry line and seems to know everyone's business by osmosis, asked me at the store if the company had put up art. I said no. She clucked and shook her head once. Should have left that shore alone, she said. There's a rhythm to what lives and what's used. Someone's clapping off beat now. Sonny at the fuel dock didn't talk to me at all. He looked over my shoulder, eyes on the water behind me, and in the reflection of the plexiglass I saw him trace a sign with his thumb on his palm that my grandmother used to trace when we rounded a headland. I felt like someone had thrown a net over my shoulders when I saw him do it. Not because of what it meant, but because it set me in a story I didn't want to be in. The third night the fog lifted. A north wind scraped the surface of the inlet, and the lights had an easy reach. The halogens threw white on the water, and it read as metal more than liquid. I didn't see any of the shapes where they'd been. There was something like relief and something like disappointment. And I'm not proud of the second part, but there it is. Fear starts to tie you to the thing you fear, because fear likes a track it can run on. Around 1 a.m, a branch knocked the shack door. It banged twice, not like wind, more like someone in a hurry who still didn't want to be heard. When I opened the door, there wasn't anyone there. Just a piece of root ball the size of a boot sitting upright like it had been set for me to see, with eelgrass tangled around it. It smelled like the yard had smelled. I stood over it with my flashlight and felt embarrassed in a way that had nothing to do with other people. I picked it up. The eelgrass was wet and cold as fish skin. I took it to the burn barrel near the dumpster and dropped it in. The barrel is thick steel and never fills. It eats anything you feed it, slow and heavy and bright. Green wood smokes when it burns. It gives off a smell that's sweet and black. But the root ball didn't need coaxing. It didn't sputter. It went like paper, yellow and then clean blue. The eelgrass made a sound like breaking fingers. Tiny, rapid pops as the water in them flashed to steam. I stood with my palms out like a sinner to a different altar. The heat felt good after the damp. I should have left it at that. But fatigue makes you dumb and pride makes you reckless. I grabbed one of the longer pieces of driftwood in the yard and jammed it into the barrel like I was proving a point. I fed the barrel until the glow colored my boots. When I got back to my house, the porch light flickered again. This time it stayed dim, as if everything in the circuit was tired. I opened the door and the smell stepped into me. I don't mean it flowed around me. I mean it stepped. I staggered back and my shoulder hit the siding, and I heard a soft, clear sound from inside like something light and rigid bending and clacking back into place. For a second I thought Jared was back and playing a joke. Then I remembered he'd gone to Craig for parts and wasn't due until Friday. Every piece of wood in that living room looked wet. The floorboards had a salt sheen. The coffee table I'd built out of salvaged planks had darkened, as if its oil rose. There were footprints again, not on the floor this time, but on the wall. Press marks that began at the baseboard and walked up, then angled across near the ceiling and vanished at the corner where the kitchen starts. They looked like an animal's gait in the wrong dimension, the way a spider climbs a glass. I could hear it again, that dry crackle. It took me a moment to place it. There are little insects that live in timber, and if you've ever carried a log long enough, you've heard them ticking. Like a pocket watch tapped against your palm. That sound was in my walls. My phone rang and I almost jumped out of my skin. It was May. "I can't sleep," she said. "It feels strange tonight. Like when you know you left the kettle on and you're trying to remember if you turned it off." I stared at the door frames and saw that the paint had lifted in hairline fractures. Lines had appeared where there hadn't been any that morning, the way old wood opens like dry lips. "Don't come up here," I said, which made no sense because she wasn't coming, and once I said it I wanted to take it back. It felt like I just told the water where to find her. "What happened?" "I set something on fire at work," I said. It was nothing, but now I think it wasn't nothing. There was silence, then a long breath. "Old Ruth came by the store at closing," she said. "She told me if you brought anything from the shore inside, you should take it back. She said not to wipe your feet if they're wet. The floor has prints on it, May. I laughed because the other option was not laughing, and they're not mine. Okay, she said in a voice I use for panicked customers when the ferry is canceled. Okay, pack a bag and come down here. I'll make coffee. We can figure it out in the morning. I walked to the bedroom to grab something and stopped when I saw the mirror. It had fogged. Not like bathroom steam, more like breath. Someone had stood close and exhaled hard again and again. The glass was a patchwork of ovals, and between them, through the clearer spots, I saw my own face. It looked fine, tired, but okay. Then I raised my hand, and in the mirror the skin along my knuckles didn't bend smooth. It folded with little fractures, pale lines across the brown like cracks in a lake after a hard night. The mirror cleared a fraction as if the room exhaled. I touched the glass. It was cool, and my fingertip left a dry squeak. When I closed the front door behind me, the wood made a sound I'd never noticed. A low groan, not of hinges, but of fibers. It sounded like the house was trying to talk, and it was stuck with a voice it hadn't used in too long. I didn't sleep that day, even at May's place. She put me in the spare room and made soup and sat on the floor with her back to the bed and told me about inventory and snow tires and a woman who paid in quarters. Anything to keep my mind on rails. But I couldn't stop smelling it in her house too, just faintly, like a coat you hung next to a smoker's. When I rubbed my eyes, something gritty came away on my fingers. I looked and there were tiny tan specks, sawdust. Except I hadn't been cutting anything. I didn't want to go back that evening. I went because you go back. That's how small places work. You don't call in and say Driftwood followed you home and your house has started breathing. You put on your coat. You go. Jared was at the dock when my shift started. He was tying off and whistling off key like he does when he's pretending he's not worried. He looked past me toward the river mouth. "You seeing that?" he said low. They stood at the line where water met the yard. Not 1, not 3. 7, maybe 8. Some barely higher than my belt. Some tall enough that you felt like you should nod to them the way you nod to big men you pass who aren't looking at you. Each had a knot or burl where a head would be, and each burl was hollowed. From where we stood, the holes read as dark mouths. Every one of them faced in. "They were closer this morning," Jared said. "I watched them through the radio window while I was calling out the weather, and I could see the eelgrass on one like hair." "That's stupid," I said, my voice flat. "It's just sticks." "Yeah," he said. "Let's keep it that way." We worked in the sphere of the lights, and the dark outside the lights felt like eyes. I thought about burning them again, and the thought felt like the feeling you get when you know you're about to be cruel. That you can be cruel to wood is a dumb thought. It didn't feel dumb then. Around 2, the north wind dropped, and all at once the water went slick as a coat. The halogens carved bright paths over it. I moved toward the ramp to see if the tide had turned because I wanted something practical to account for the way my stomach dropped. My boot hit something on the step. I bent, thinking it was a piece of metal that could be a trip hazard. It was my ID badge. I'd lost it a week earlier. I'd looked everywhere. It had been sitting now in a puddle on the ramp, and it was threaded through with eelgrass as if someone had carried it there in a mouth and set it carefully, flat side up so my name showed. When I lifted it, the eelgrass came with it in a long wet ribbon. I gagged at the smell. I can't say I decided to run. I can only say I was moving, and my body was already halfway to the shack before my mind caught up. Halfway to the door, I heard it. Boots on plank, the sound you know because it's you, except it wasn't. It was that dry tick and a slap of wet weight with it. I turned, and in the edge of the light I saw the smaller one, the one I'd first tipped that first night standing on the ramp where my badge had been. It moved. Not like we move. It rearranged. The driftwood body shivered and the eelgrass tightened across it. And for a second the burl tilted and I saw the whole of it like a listening ear that had been cut where a mouth should be. The water ran off it in lines. Its shadow stretched toward me like a pile of broom handles. "You're seeing this," I said to nobody or to Jared or to the poles themselves. "I'm seeing it," Jared said from somewhere behind me. Light and breath in his voice, hand on my shoulder but not resting, ready to pull or push. Somewhere out on the water, a night herring slapped, and all at once they were closer. 2 at least. Then 3. Their feet didn't splash. That almost undid me more than everything else. Wet things splash. They did not. They set themselves down like furniture moved one room over. You could hear the tick of little lives inside them. A dozen watches set to the same minute. I wish I could say I stood. I've stood for men angrier than me and for weather that didn't care if I lived. I backed toward the shack and then behind it to the burn barrel like a child going to where the light lives. The barrel was cold. Its rim was dotted with ash from that night. The steel had a touch of frost. I stared at a crescent of char that clung inside and could see in it the delicate structure of grain reading like a map of a tree's decisions. I reached for the lighter in my pocket and my fingers didn't work right. Not clumsy, stiff, like the cold had gotten past my skin and into the joints. The knuckles made that tiny crack when I forced them. "That's enough," Jared said, and the condition of his voice was the ladder I could climb. "We're going to get in the shack and call Carla. We're going to call Sonny. We're going to call the trooper if we have to, and they can write it up as kids keeping us busy. We'll be the fools and that will be good. I don't want to keep telling you about how scared I was. I want to tell you about something you can picture. The stain that spread from the burl mouths when fog drifted close. Darker in the center, like exhalation. The way my house's baseboards had split like smiling. The way the wood in the desk in the shack had felt warmer to my fingers than my own skin. I want to tell you that because the other part is just thresholds, and I crossed them one after the other until there wasn't one left between me and it. We got into the shack. We locked the door, which was funny, because the thing we feared could walk through what the door was made of. I radioed. Static. I tried the landline we keep for the tug captain who hates cell phones. Dead. The heater roared and the propane hissed as if warm air could assert a law. It didn't. I could feel the wet breath under the door. I pulled my boots off because my feet were numb, and I wanted to feel something to confirm I was still attached to myself. That's when I saw the skin at my heel. It had split in a fine, shallow line, and the edges were pale the way wood shows fresh when you peel bark. Jared saw me look. We're the kind of friends who don't say much out loud because we don't have to. He didn't make a sound. He put his hand on the table, palm down, and pressed, and I watched him leave moisture on the ironwood like it was sweating. He lifted his hand and there were those prints again. Faint. Lined. The impression of long, thin contact points not quite like fingers. "I burned one," I said, and my voice sounded hollow even to me, like it was coming through a short pipe. I burned what I thought was nothing. Maybe it wasn't nothing. We waited for daylight. It took its time, and I think it did that on purpose. When gray finally showed, the shapes weren't at the ramp anymore. They had moved to the shoreline to our right, out of the light. They stood shoulder to shoulder near the place where old logs go to rot. A fresh one had climbed the bank. I say climbed because it sat there in a way that defied tide. The way the last high water leaves a log on a shelf and you wonder how something so heavy got that high. I could see orange rope in its middle and the way eelgrass had dried across its chest like bandages. I knew, without knowing how, that it was the one I had burned, remade from the same water, the same shore, gathered by the same hand. Carla showed up late because her truck wouldn't start, and she stood with her arms crossed and her head tilted and said, "Language I can't write here." A trooper came in the afternoon and he walked down the ramp with his thumbs hooked in his vest like you do when your hands don't know what to do. He had the good sense to look smaller than he was. "Art project," he said first and then stopped saying that. Somebody in town started calling them the Driftwood men and the name stuck because it was simple. People asked questions like people do when something new appears in a place where nothing new appears unless it's weather or a baby. Ruth brought me a jar of spruce tips and sugar syrup and told me to smear it on the frames where the paint had cracked. "You can't fight rot with dry things," she said. "You cut the wet out or you feed it something sweet." At night, I stopped sleeping at home. I put a mattress under the counter in the store and pretended I was doing inventory. I kept waking with my mouth so dry it sparked. I started carrying a cup everywhere. Water tasted wrong, flat like it had been poured hours ago. My voice did something when I spoke. It rang a little. It's a strange thing to hear resonance in yourself you didn't put there. Words wobbled like they were coming off a guitar body. May stopped me one morning and touched my throat with the back of her finger. "You got a splinter?" she asked. I hadn't noticed until then that swallowing hurt. It gets blurry here the way days blur when you live on a tide schedule and not a clock. I know it rained. It always rains there. Once you get the smell of rot in your clothes, you measure time by when it returns after you wash them. I know men came in from other towns and stood at the shore and stared. I know someone late at night tried to push one into the water and broke his wrist without quite understanding how he'd done it. And afterward, he wouldn't speak to us and went back to his skiff and left without lights. 2 weeks in, I went back to my house at noon while the sun made a brave attempt at brightness. I thought maybe I could get my jacket because May kept telling me not to ruin hers. The porch steps were slick and green-black. When I opened the door, it moved too smoothly, as if somebody had shaved the wood away into a better fit. The living room was dry. The smell had thinned to something you only notice if you stop breathing and then start again. The footprints were gone. The wall where the prince had climbed was clean, except the paint had settled into the grain a little deeper, so the surface looked like it still held the memory of rising lines. I sat on the couch. The cushion sighed like it had been waiting to be relieved. I ran my hand along the arm and felt a burr. When I looked, I saw a hairline sliver of wood under the fabric. It had worked through from inside, capillary strong. I pinched it and pulled, and it kept coming. A thin, pale curl like what falls from a plane when a carpenter is careful. It broke between my fingers and fell to my lap. I didn't brush it away. I just watched it, and I listened to my own breath resonate through an aching throat, and I realized how quiet it had gotten. Not peaceful. Held. The mirror wasn't fogged this time. It was clear and bright, and it made the small room look like another room if you squinted. I stood in front of it, and I saw a tired man, and I saw a line along his lip that hadn't been there last year, and I saw the skin on his knuckles like a shallow riverbed in summer. When I swallowed, I watched my throat click and the skin in the hollow above my collarbone shift like bark under a hand. And I thought, maybe this is how it always happens. Maybe the things we walk past every day are carrying our reflection back to us in a slower language, and we only notice when the grammar changes. I picked up my jacket, and when I did, a handful of sawdust fell from the hook to the floor. It wasn't there an hour before because I would have seen it. It looked fresh and pale, like breath when you can see it. I stared at it and stamped it into the floorboards with my heel, and the sound it made was too soft for the force I used. I stepped again, and again. The dust pressed flat, then rose back a little as if the boards exhaled. I left the house and didn't lock it. The company put up a fence along the bank. It was a joke that satisfied the part of people that needed someone to do something. The Driftwood men didn't move for a day. Then somebody saw them on the other side. No one said how they got there. They just were. That's when people stopped telling themselves it was a prank. That's when my jaw started to click when I ate. And when I slept, I dreamed I was chewing bark and waking with splinters between my teeth. I would scrape my tongue against them and taste sap. There's a spot at the far end of the yard where the logs sometimes come to rest if a chain breaks. A little cove tucked under the old pilings where tide swirls longer. I went there on a break one night because my chest hurt and the heater was making it worse. I stood with my hands tucked into my armpits and let the cold pin the air there while I watched the wind draw lines on the water. One of them was standing there, not at the fence line where the others gathered. Alone, half in the shade of a leaning cedar. I don't know how I knew it was the same one I burned. There was a shape to its middle. A wide space like ribs had been there once and weren't anymore. Okay, I said out loud to the thing and to the black water and to my own stubborn skull. I'm sorry. I'd said that before to people. It sounds different when you say it to a shore. It's less an apology and more a statement of ignorance. I didn't know what I was doing, I added. I still don't. Something in the water made a slow drag sound like a heavy rope being pulled along the bottom. The cedar above creaked. A raven who'd been ignoring us gave one hard knock like a hammer strike and then went quiet. The burl tilted a little and I could see straight into it. The hole wasn't empty. It wasn't full either. It held the same thing the gap between boards holds when you drop your keys. Darkness near and darkness deep. I'll take it back, I said. The words felt small. I'll put what I can back. You can't put back fire. The barrel had done what barrels do. But there were pieces. Char curled like shells. I collected them in a plastic tote with a broken clasp and walked to the place where I'd first kicked the thing apart. I set the pieces down. It felt both ridiculous and necessary, which is probably a good sign you're doing something that makes a difference. I didn't say any special words. I just worked, and the working felt like something I could still do. I tucked eelgrass through gently, the way you thread your fingers with a friend's when you don't want them to think you're upset, even though you are. I got splinters. I didn't pull them. I let them sit under the skin like punctuation I hadn't earned. I slept on May's floor that night and woke because it was too quiet to be night. I lay there with my eyes open and listened for my own breath. I didn't hear anything at first, and for a second I wondered if I'd stopped. Then faint I heard it, not through my ears. Through wood. Through floor and joist and beam, I heard breathing. Not one set of lungs. More like the way trees heave in a squall and then settle. And you only notice because every leaf does it at once. I put my hand against the baseboard and felt it. A slow, patient in and out. I left the next week. I told Carla I needed a break, and she shrugged hard enough to say she didn't have many bodies to spare and then softened and said to go. I told May I'd be back before spring because that's what you say when you don't know. Jared drove me to the ferry and waited while I stood at the rail to watch for logs at the surface, and then he squeezed my shoulder and said nothing, because that's what he does when there are too many words to get through. I'm writing this from a motel 1,000 miles away in a place that smells like sun on tar instead of rain on wood. I sleep with the heat on to dry the room to a crackle. It doesn't help. I wake at 4 every morning and the air is cool even when the thermostat says it shouldn't be, and my mouth tastes like the inside of a cedar box. When I shower, water beads and runs off me fast, and when I press a towel to my skin I can smell sap in the cotton. The lines on my knuckles haven't gone away. I taped over the mirror's edges because it was starting to edge silver, and the pattern looked like the shape of river maps in spring. My voice has a hollowness now that doesn't belong to me. People ask if I have a cold. I don't know what happens if you ignore something that wants you to become a different shape. Maybe it gives up and looks for a closer fit. Maybe it outlasts you. I've read about driftwood that comes ashore after a storm and sits 3 inches above high water for decades, bleaching, being carved by nothing but air. It doesn't look like it moves, but if you measure where the weeds grow around its base, you'll see lines that weren't there last year. Movement by other means. Sometimes late, I think I hear rain on water even in this dry place. It's not rain season here, and the sound doesn't match the roof. It's the sound of small things hitting a surface with patience. When I sit up, the sound keeps going for a few breaths, and I imagine the halogen lights and the steel cables and the holes in the burls like mouths listening. Then it stops, same way it did back home, like someone paused and leaned in to listen back. No one has called to tell me the driftwood went away. No one has called to say it got worse. May texts me pictures of muffins and her dog wearing a scarf, and sometimes, if I ask what the water looks like, she sends me a photo of fog that could be anywhere. Jared sent me a photo of an empty ramp at dawn with a caption that said, "Tide fell hard last night," and nothing else. In the frame, if you look where the light breaks, there's something dark that could be a stump and could be a person with shoulders. There's a smudge near the mouth of the river that could be a shadow and could be a hole watching. On the day I left, I put the last piece of char I had in the tote and carried it down to the water. I set it near where the eelgrass knots, and I tried to thread it in with my hands numb from cold. The char stained my fingers. It flaked and got under my nails, and some part of me, the part that knows practical things like loose straps and fuel shutoffs and how to keep your fingers out of a bad pinch, told me to wash the black away so I didn't carry it into my car. I didn't, I let it stick. The wind lifted, and for a second the blue between gray broke and shone on the water. I think about that light a lot. It found all the wet places and made them more themselves. I keep the tote under the bed in whatever room I sleep in now. It smells like a shore that doesn't belong to this place. When I wake and the room feels like a stump's hollow, I slide the tote out and lift the lid. I don't touch it. I just look. It calms me to know the pieces are still there. It also scares me to measure in my head how much of what I burned I have not put back. A week ago, I noticed something on the motel floor by the door, a pattern of wet where there hadn't been any. It wasn't footprints. It wasn't that literal. It was a darkening of grain that moved from the door to the bathroom and then back to the door, like a tide had come and gone in a line only I could see. When I pressed my palm to it, my hand came away cooler than when I'd set it down. I wiped it with a towel. It returned the next day a few inches to the right. I tell myself it's a leak. I tell myself the heat is bad and causes condensation. I tell myself I'll go home when the ferry runs more regular and I can sit on the rail and count logs again like you count sheep. I tell myself a lot of things. In the mornings, my voice sounds like the inside of something hollow and old. I drink water and it tastes like last night's rain. In the mirror, when I raise my hands and open my fingers, the lines on my knuckles catch the light in a way that reads as grain. When I whisper, the sound in my chest has a timbre to it I didn't put there. I'm writing this to put it somewhere. Maybe what took me isn't done. Maybe it wasn't trying to take me at all. Maybe it was only showing me the shape of what happens when you burn something that knows its own name and stands up where the land is a thin edge between tides. I didn't believe in that kind of thing until I saw it. And even now I try not to attach any words bigger than what it was. Ashore, wood, water. The company pushed too close, and if there's a balance, we stepped on it. The forest takes its time. The coast takes its time. Time is their fire. If you go to port protection and walk past the yard in the dusk with the tide climbing, and you see a line of shapes that make you think of men despite not being men, you might feel like someone is watching you, and you might be right. If your porch light flickers when you close the door, try not to listen too hard. If you smell something dark and green and alive when everything else in your room is dry, don't pretend you don't. Don't burn it to prove you're smarter than wood. Don't bring it inside to prove you're kinder. Don't pretend it didn't put its wet hands on your floor. I used to correct people about tides. Now I wake at 4 and can tell by the ache in my jaw how far the water has to go before it turns. Some mornings I put my palm flat on the wall and I feel it, slow as breath. The wood taking air in and letting air out like it's practicing words it hasn't learned yet. I move my mouth to match. Nothing comes, not yet. But sometimes, when the room is so quiet the heater sounds like surf. I find myself standing, and I don't remember deciding to stand, and my feet are set just a little wider apart than they're used to, and my hands open like they would if there were eelgrass near that needed holding. I don't know how to end this because I don't know if it's ended. The motel's desk is a hollow core and it doesn't sing back when I touch it, and I'm grateful for that. But the baseboard has started to crack in fine pale lines that move when the light changes. The tote under the bed is heavier than it should be for what's inside. When I bend to lift it, the hinges make a soft tick like small lives keeping time, and when I set it down, the room listens. And for a long breath, so do I. I was going to leave this in my field notes and pretend it was a stress dream, but last night the radiator in my apartment clicked in perfect syllables, so here we are. I'm an engineer. I do coastal work no one wants to think about. Erosion mitigation, emergency surveys, the paperwork that follows after a shoreline eats someone's yard. You wouldn't know my name, and I'd like to keep it that way. What I need is to put this somewhere people might believe me, because pretending it didn't happen hasn't made it stop. They sent me to Shishmaref last spring with 2 weeks' notice and a stack of maps that looked like bite marks. If you don't know it, it's a barrier island village in Alaska, a long sliver of sand and permafrost where the wind has a personality and the sea comes straight for you without introductions. The company said it would be straightforward. Survey the undermined bluffs, mark safe zones, check existing gabions, propose short-term measures and long-term relocation ideas. That's the language we use. It keeps your mind tidy. It reduces homes to polygons and slumps to light blue hatch marks you can measure with a ruler. I took Ty with me. He's a younger engineer, smart in the way that gets him into trouble, and he treats equipment like it has feelings. We flew a contractor's shuttle out of Nome with a pilot who looked as if he'd been carved from driftwood. A woman named Mara, a local liaison and teacher, met us on the airstrip. She wore a heavy parka and a wool hat that had seen better days and smiled with her eyes when the wind took her breath away. "You'll want to keep your gloves on even when you don't think you need them," she said. And when I tried to shake her hand, she only laughed and bumped my elbow with hers. "Save your fingers," she said. They put us up in a modular shack near the school, the kind of box you can lift with a crane and set down like a Monopoly piece. The generator thudded at night and made the utensils click in their drawer. Ty set up the LiDAR drone on the kitchen table and treated it like a pet, wiping the lenses with a cloth he'd brought from home. I set the survey maps on the counter and pretended the lines didn't mean what they did. Shishmaref is one of those places where you can watch the earth lose its conviction. One day there's a path by the water where kids walk, and the next day it's a scalloped bite into brown slush and ice that looks bruised. The waves don't crash as much as they insist. The sky grinds overhead. Dogs bark at nothing and then at everything. Our first morning, Mara walked us to the beach and introduced us to an elder everyone called Anna, a woman whose face had lines that were almost maps, too. She was ordering some kids away from the edge with a voice that made even the wind pay attention. "You here to measure what's already gone?" she said to me. There wasn't contempt in it, just a kind of tired joke. I told her we were there to help figure out how to stay safe. "You don't keep an ice wall from remembering its water," she said. "You only decide where to stand while it remembers." Ty elbowed me later and whispered, "You never told me we were walking into a poem." I told him to check the GPS rods for loose connections and not to trip over any of the old car parts that had washed into the snow. staked a baseline and started logging. The bluff edge was a ragged line of thawed ground and old refuse. Sometimes the sea carries you its ledger, a rusted axle, an orange crate stamped with some company that no longer exists, a bottle scoured opaque. When we hammered the stakes, the ground yielded too easily. The active layer was already watery, even though the air bit our faces. Halfway through the day, Ty waved me over. He had the GPR sled, the ground-penetrating radar, dragging along with that tiny squeal it makes, Bluetooth chirping faintly. "We're getting weird returns," he said. "Look." The screen showed bands like usual, but the reflections had a character to them that wasn't rocks or ice lenses. They had curves, shapes. "Organic," he said, searching for the right word and not wanting to land on it. "I don't get spooked by data." I told him GPR does strange things over thawing permafrost, that voids look like a lot of things, and to mark the coordinates and keep going. We ate at the school that night. Mara ladled soup and laughed with the kitchen ladies and told us which hallways creaked and which didn't. A state trooper stopped by, shook my hand, and asked if we'd seen any bold bears. I said no. He said they come around when the wind changes. So does everything else. He waved vaguely toward the sea and took a coffee to go. I started hearing it the next night, and I'm going to say this in simple words so it doesn't sound like I'm trying to sell you a campfire story. Because I'm not. Around midnight, with the generator breathing and the utensils ticking, I heard a voice under the floor of our shack. Not a voice in the room, not in the walls. Below, muffled. Like a radio in the next apartment, but we didn't have a next apartment. It said something the way a person says something when they think no one is listening. Quick and soft and ordinary. I got up and put on my boots because that's what you do when you don't believe yourself. The floor was cold. The door stuck. The wind had found a new pitch to complain in. I stepped outside and stood with my hands jammed under my armpits and listened, and the voice came again, this time from the frozen ground under the shack's stairs. It said, clear as someone rehearsing it, I was 32 winters. And then it went to whispers. I'm not proud of how fast I went back inside and pretended I hadn't heard it. Ty was snoring on the other side of the room. I lay there with my hat on and waited for the generator to make any syllable that proved it could have been the source. It didn't. Mara took us to the far end of the village the next morning, where the island narrowed and the sea made more of itself. We passed kids playing tag with a half-flat soccer ball and an old man fixing a snowmobile with his bare hands. They both waved and squinted at the edge like it was a neighbor who might show up drunk. Anna was there again, wrapped up in a parka that made her look like a lighthouse. She didn't smile. "You're not sleeping," she said. It wasn't a question. I told her our generator was temperamental. She nodded like she'd let me keep the lie and then took my elbow and steered me to a patch of ground not far from the bluff. It looked like any other patch. Long brown grass pressed in the wind's direction. A crust of snow like the skin on soup. They used to bury along here, she said, when the summers were reliable and the earth kept its promises. The old ones before my parents' parents. She tapped her boot against the ground gently. Sometimes when the shore goes, the old ones come with it. We move what we find to where the bluff won't argue. But we haven't always found what's there before the sea does. You hear anything last night? I told her no. I told her we were too tired to hear. She looked at me a long time, then said, "The thaw lets things loose that were meant to stay in place. Voices, too. They don't know they should be quiet." That afternoon, the wind switched. It came off the water with a lower tone, and the dogs were unsettled. They barked and then stopped mid-bark like they'd been shushed. Ty flew the drone for an hour and came back inside complaining that his fingers didn't feel like his. I took the GPR sled out by myself because I wanted quiet and proof, even if the proof was only that I was making too much of everything. Near the patch where Anna had tapped her boot, the screen lit up with returns that were too consistent to be run off. They were the rounded echoes you get from boxes or from, "I'm not going to fill it in for you." I stood there with the wind threading through my hat and my eyes watering into my scarf, and I thought of all the maps we'd drawn, where the bluff line chewed into the pale shading that meant maybe, maybe not. I was 32 winters, the voice had said. The way you'd tell a stranger your height and hope they measured the world the same way. That night, Ty asked if he could sleep with headphones. He hadn't mentioned the voices, and I hadn't mentioned them to him. He didn't specify what he wanted to block out. "Go ahead," I said. He put in the cheap foam over-ears he brought everywhere and played some podcast about baseball. He fell asleep mid-inning. I sat up with the generator and waited. Around 1, the radiator clicked, yes, 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 and then went silent, and the voice began again. This time it wasn't one voice. It was a group, layered, as if you were walking past a park where people were telling stories to each other and you caught pieces that didn't line up to a whole. He fell into the dark water. I kept a spoon in my boot. We put stones where the light was. My brother was 6. Don't stand where the sand hums. Some of the voices sounded like they were speaking English after not using it a long time. Careful and round in the mouth. Some of them sounded like none of my languages. They moved under the floor like a current. I put on my boots again because habits are stronger than fear, and stepped outside. The wind was quieter, as if it was waiting to see what I'd do. I walked to the stairs and knelt and put my gloved hand on the ice-rimed ground. The cold came through the glove like it had intentions. The voices were clearer with my hand there, like the earth was a door and I'd cracked it. Please, one said. Stop digging, another said. Dig here, said a third, and I know how that sounds. I stood up too fast and had to catch myself on the rail. In the morning, I told Ty we were moving our tent for the field outpost closer to the bluff. It was a dumb idea by any book. I made up a reason about wanting to monitor a particular stretch overnight. He was too tired to argue. If a bear eats me because you wanted a better baseline, I'm haunting your inbox, he said, and threw the tent into the sled. We set the tent near the patch Anna had indicated, not right on it, because even in my stubbornness I was not going to pretend that what she'd said wasn't true. The ground there looked stable enough, for the definition of stable that you learn when your work is drawing lines on soft land. I made sure our guy lines were redundant. We ran the heater off a generator that coughed like a smoker. Ty zipped his bag up to his nose and fell asleep with the kind of innocence that only people who trust physics have. I lay awake and watched my breath feather and listened. The heater made its little work noises. Outside, the island scraped against the world. Underneath us, the voices came more slowly, like they had to find us. It's too close, one said, and another said, the sand keeps secrets, and someone else laughed softly, which was somehow worse than anything else. I told myself I was listening to water moving in frozen tunnels. That was the explanation I could hold. Then one of the voices said my name. Not a version of my name, my exact name. I sat up. The tent swayed a fraction with the wind. Ty muttered something in a dream about a foul ball. Don't, the voice said. Do it, another voice said, directly below my left hip, as if there were 2 mouths on either side of a plank. The ground under me felt spongy in a way frozen ground shouldn't. I unzipped my bag as carefully as I could, as if I could keep the moment from hearing me. I put my palms down on the tent floor. I put my ear down next. The cold came in like a coin under the skin. Here, the voice whispered. Here, another one insisted. The heater coughed once like it had been surprised. Ty rolled over. His headphones slipped and spilled a tinny announcer into the tent and then went quiet. The floor shifted a fraction, a different kind of shift than wind or breath, a loosening. I stood on my knees to reach for Ty's shoulder, to shake him and say something I hadn't composed. The ground let go. It wasn't dramatic. No scream of earth. No cinematic crash. It was a soft surrender, like stepping on a crust of snow that pretends for a second that it will hold you and then changes its mind. The tent dropped with us. The fabric tried to go up while the floor went down. My stomach made that floating decision it makes on airplanes. Ty woke mid-fall and shouted my name, and then the pole snapped and the heater tipped, and we slid into a place that had been earth a moment before and was now everything else. We landed on packed sand that held. The tent was a collapsed bright thing around us. My headlamp was 3 inches away, and for a moment I saw nothing, which is scarier than seeing anything. I found the lamp and clicked it, and the light made a small place in a large dark. We were in a cavity. Not a cave. I've been in caves. This was a room the island had been keeping. The roof was not far above our heads, the walls too close, the air dull with things that hadn't moved in a long time. The heater gurgled and then turned itself off. My breath made a little weather. Ty was cursing in a whisper. He had a cut on his cheek where the pole had gotten him. He put his hand to it and checked his glove like he expected to see something dramatic. He didn't. The silence came back as if it had been patient. I want to tell you this part without flourish, with just the measurements of what happened. We were in a space that had been hollowed by thaw and time. The walls were sand and old wood that looked like rib bones from a ship, but they weren't. They were box sides. Many box sides. The light caught the corner of a board that had been worked by someone's hands a long time ago and had grain the color of old tea. The air smelled like minerals and something sweet that was not pleasant. I moved the lamp and saw a cloth bundle propped against the wall, and it had the shape of a person resting, and the cloth had the kind of wear cloth gets when it survives its owner. Beside it there was another bundle, smaller. The lamp made the texture look like skin and then like burlap and then like both at once, and that's as far as I want to go describing it. The whispering was there with us. Not below anymore. At the same level. It was like being in a room where a conversation is happening in the corner, and if you turn your head too fast, it stops. He fell, someone observed, as if making a note. We fell, another corrected. Ty reached for my sleeve and didn't find it and then did. He squeezed. He said very softly, "We have to go." The roof creaked. Sand thudded in little avalanches. I couldn't tell you the safest route out. If you gave me a blueprint, everything we'd drilled into our heads about load and void and angle was useless in that moment. The hole above us was a tilted oval with a fringe of tent. Ty pointed and I shook my head because pointing felt like it might offend the air. "Don't stand where the sand hums," a voice whispered, like it was giving me the answer to a question no one had asked aloud. I put the lamp on my head and spread my hands and listened with my palms. The ground to the right had a tightness to it you get when water has refrozen and locked grains together. The left had a softness that made the hair on my arms make decisions. I moved right. Ty followed. The bundles did not move, because of course they didn't, because moving is not the only way to be present. We climbed. It wasn't a long climb. It felt like a long climb. The sand sloughed under our knees. At one point my hand sank into a pocket that felt like a lung deflating, and I jerked it back so fast I scraped my knuckles through my glove. The voices rose around us, not in volume but in number, and I heard a child say calmly, "Up," and a man say, "Stop, wait, go," and a woman say, "Don't look." And I didn't. I didn't look. Ty got a knee onto a ledge that existed for just that moment and grabbed the tent edge and hauled. I pushed from below. The fabric ripped where it had abraded on the wood. The wind came in through the tear like a reprimand. We came out into a world that hadn't changed and somehow had. The tent lay half in, half out, like a caught fish. The hole was the size of our table back home. The island wind had found its voice again and was scolding everything. Anna was there. I don't know how she moved so fast in that cold. Mara was not far behind her, cheeks raw, eyes large. The state trooper came too, with a rope he didn't use. Anna looked at us and then at the hole, and if shock crossed her face, it did it privately. She put her hand on my shoulder. It was light. "You went where you should not," she said, and there was no anger, only fact. "They were not asking you. They were telling you not to step." I tried to form English, it came out as gestures. Ty sat down in the snow and began to cry without sound and then with it. And then he stopped like he'd remembered something. "I heard my name," I said finally. "They know names," she said. "Bodies seem to go quiet, but the names don't. We did what we had to after that. You make calls. You mark the area. You take the respectful steps. They brought people who know what to do when the earth lets go of things it promised to hold. We were asked questions I answered with the smallest words possible. Someone asked if we'd been authorized to camp where we had, and I said, no, and waited for my work to change shape. It didn't, not right then. The new map lines grew careful teeth around that stretch of bluff. I didn't sleep any night after that. Not really. The voices didn't come into the shack the way they had. But once you've heard a thing under your feet talk to you, any silence sounds like it's holding its breath. Ty went home early. Mara hugged him before he got on the plane and told him to warm up somewhere with bad coffee and bright lights. He did. My last day, I stood with Anna on the edge again and watched a sheet of ice peel away from a little lake like old tape from a window. "They talked to me," I said, "and I don't know why I needed her to know it when she already did." "They're not all ours," she said. "Some came here from places that don't have names anymore and were given names here. Some came from here. Some we will never know. What you heard is what happens when you're not from here and you put your ear down and ask a place to tell you a story it doesn't want to tell you." "I wasn't asking," I said. She didn't disagree. She looked at the horizon. The light did that Arctic thing where it seemed like it had been poured and frozen mid-pour. "We'll move what we can," she said. "We'll keep listening. You will go back." She touched my sleeve. "Don't put your ear to the ground for a while where you live," she said. "The ground remembers who listens." I came back to my apartment with its reliable radiator and the sound of buses on wet streets. I stacked my field notebooks in the closet next to the old boots I swear are still thawing. I didn't tell anyone the whole of it, not even Ty, who didn't return my text with anything more than emojis for a week and then sent a photo of his dog asleep under a table. I turned on white noise at night and pretended it was just an appliance pretending to be rain. Last night the radiator clicked in perfect syllables. It said my name, and I froze the way a person freezes when their childhood knocks at their door. Then it said something that didn't make sense in this city at this hour in this building, where the downstairs neighbor plays jazz too loud. It said in that careful voice you use when you're claiming something, "I was 32 winters." The pipe was cold when I touched it. The wall hum beneath my palm had the same tightness as the right-hand path out of the hole. I don't want this to be contagious. I want it to be a thing that happened in a place with conditions I can label and then leave behind. But the sink gurgled as I was writing this, and it sounded like a man describing a spoon in a boot. The radiator went quiet when I looked at it. The way the voices stopped when I turned my head too fast under the ground. The city wind slipped between the buildings and made a sound like a laugh that could have been anything. I haven't put my ear to the floor. I'm not going to. I moved my bed away from the heat pipes and I sleep with socks on even in June, as if that will keep names from finding me. Some mornings I think I misheard everything and that I'm telling you about stress in technical weather. Then a bus passes and the window glass trembles, and the tremble arranges itself into a word no bus should know. It says, "Here," and I don't know if it's a warning or an invitation. I don't know if a thaw has an end. I only know the ground under us is not as quiet as we think, and some promises cannot be kept once the wind learns your name. I'm not here to convince you. I've already done the whole, maybe I imagined it loop 100 times, and what's left is the part where I say it out loud so it stops living behind my eyes every time the house gets quiet. I worked as the volunteer radio operator in Kivalina last winter, when the storm stacked one on top of another until the ocean was just a moving wall, and the sky felt 2 inches above the tower lamp. If you've never been that far north, imagine the world as a gray bowl with one bright pin stuck through it, the red beacon on the tower, humming and flashing above everything like a heartbeat you can see. That's where I sat, in a one-room station that smelled like warm dust, diesel, and coffee that had steeped too long on a hot plate. My name's Nate. I keep things running when they break. It's not heroic. It's mostly tightening loose screws before they tear out and tracing wires to find the one that's pretending to be fine. In Kivalina, that meant the weather station, the radio, the backup generator, and sometimes the satellite internet when it was in a mood. We've got a clinic and a school and neighbors who know each other by footsteps. We also have weather that moves like a decision. When the first big storm rolled in that week, it took the internet and the cell booster like it always does. The second storm took power across half the village and made the rest flicker. By the time the third hit, it didn't matter whose house had lights on. We were all living by whatever we could make hum on our own. The station has its own generator, a squat green thing with a cough like an old smoker. When the main line went dead, I kicked the generator over, and the light stuttered back. The tower beacon kept its slow, steady blink. The space heater's fan spun up and I put my hand in front of it and felt air just warm enough to pretend it mattered. I told myself we were lucky. We had VHF, HF, the emergency channels, a weather fax, a big stainless thermos, and a candy jar everyone's kids would attack in better weather. On the first night, the wind pushed at the siding until the screws whined. I checked the guy wires through the frosted window and could feel the tower's vibration through the floorboards. I logged routine traffic for a while, the usual check-ins from boats further down the coast, a trooper aircraft on the edge of range. Then the band went quiet, the way it does when wind and ice climb up into the cables and squeeze. I got up to crack the door, more out of habit than need, and the cold walked right through me. That's when the first call came in. It wasn't a mayday. No one said the word. It was a voice that carried the tired half-shout of someone talking over wind. Female, I thought, maybe mid-30s. She gave a name I've turned over so much that now I'm afraid I'm remembering it wrong. I'll call her Annie and hope she forgives me if that's not it. She said, "Radio, this is Annie at the next village over. We've got 3 kids and an elder needing evac. We lost heat." I thumbed the mic, told her this was Kivalina station, asked for coordinates. She gave me something that didn't fit any of our landmarks. I repeated it back. She repeated it back to me like I'd said it wrong, then added, "We're at the church and the school right between. You know the path. There isn't a church in the next village over. There isn't a next village over, period. Not in the way she meant it. There used to be a settlement upriver that the elders still talk about. It wasn't down the coast. It was partway inland, and it had a single-room school and a small chapel with a bell that froze to its yoke. So often the rope wore smooth. It was abandoned after erosion and a winter where the ice broke wrong. That was 2 decades ago. The buildings were scavenged and the rest swallowed or buried. I grew up hearing about it without ever seeing more than a piece of a foundation when the snow receded in the spring. I didn't say any of that to Annie. I asked for a repeat. She hesitated. Then her voice cracked like someone had just opened a door behind her and let the storm in. "We can see your tower light," she said, the words clipped by static. "It's blinking. We're close. Please hurry." The tower light was blinking because the tower light always blinked. It was required and it never fails until it does, and then you fix it fast. It wasn't a beacon in the poetic sense. It was a literal one for planes. I asked the rote questions. Number of people. Heat source. Do you have lights? Can you shelter in place? The mic picked up my breath and made it sound like there were 2 of me in the room. She said there were 5. The elder had a deep cough. They'd tried to get the generator to start, but the pull cord snapped. "The roads drifted over," she said. "The kids are cold. He's sleeping." I told her I was going to call the troopers and ask the clinic to prep. I wrote their name on the log and the time. The pencil shook because my hands had cooled off under the heater's weak breath. I called the trooper frequency and got nothing but the rolling hiss HF turns to when the atmosphere is temperamental. I tried the clinic. We had power, but the lines out of the building were probably down because I got ring with no voice. I switched back to the channel she'd used and asked her to stay on if she could. Another voice came through instead, like a kid whose face is full of air and excitement. He said, "We can see you, Mr. Radio. You have a red hat. Mama says don't fall asleep." I had a red watch cap on. I kept my mouth shut because I suddenly could hear my heartbeat in my teeth. I looked at the window like checking would make the right answer happen. I knew the tower light would paint the snow in pulses. It always did. "Annie," I said, to keep it on rails. "We're working on rescue. Keep everyone together. Turn off anything not needed to conserve heat." Then, because the kid's voice didn't read like prank or cruelty or anything except cold and tired, I added, "Tell the kids it's going to be okay." The wind pushed more snow across the window until the world outside was a moving white wall. I kept both hands on the desk like I'd lift off if I didn't. The radio's needle hopped every time the gusts peaked. I measured the signal strength on instinct, wrote it next to their name. It didn't tell me much. Strong, then weaker, like they were moving or the storm was slotting itself between us in sheets. I stayed on until 3 in the morning. I walked home with the headlamp's beam catching the snow like it was full of falling paper. In bed, the house creaked and the tower's hum traveled through the floor like a sound you hear with your bones. I slept an hour at a time and woke with the sensation of having missed a call. The second night, the voice was a man. He claimed he'd been a maintenance worker and had a tool chest they could barely move. He asked if we had spare diesel and if I could send someone to tow them out. I told him we were still cut off and the snow machine trails were blown over and unsafe. He said, "We see your footprints." He described where mine curved when I left the station that morning, how my right boot dragged a little. I had wrenched my knee shoveling a drift back from the generator shed. I hadn't told anyone because there wasn't anyone to tell who didn't have their own list of small pains. "Where are you?" I asked, whispering without meaning to. The mic doesn't care what volume you use. The storm fills the gaps either way. "Between," he said. "Always between. Church and school. Tower and beach. Now and later. Can you bring blankets? Annie's got one." The elder gave his to the kids. "Tell me landmarks," I said, forcing my voice back to steady. "Anything I can see." He laughed once, a sound that didn't have meanness in it, just a kind of astonished emptiness. "We can see you," he said. "You're tapping your pencil. It's the yellow one. Your left hand smells like diesel." He wasn't wrong. I tried adrenaline for a while as a substitute for logic, then I tried logic. Skip could do weird things with voices. With the right conditions, you could hear someone far off as if they were next door, and someone right down the road as if they were speaking through a sock. And if it was a prank, it wasn't a local one. No one had the time or the appetite for that during storms, and anyone who knew me well enough to describe my knee would also know that there was nothing funny about tying up emergency channels when the clinic might need them. I thought of kids stuck somewhere because their parents had been reckless and then tried instantly to be kinder in my head. I'd gotten stuck. I'd given my mother a worry ulcer repeatedly when I was 16. Night 3, the voice was back to Annie. She told me the elder's name. It belonged to a man who taught my cousin to set a net when I was 11, who had died in his sleep on a couch that smelled like coffee and wood smoke long before I came back up north. I didn't know what to do with that. It wasn't a common name, but it wasn't unique either. The way she said it felt like someone setting a postcard on the desk between us. A proof-of-life photo can lie, too. I kept the channel open and told slivers of truth back. We had blankets, we had cots in the school gym, we had people willing to help. The weather would clear. Around midnight, the school's custodian, Lena, came to the station with a thermos and a bag of fry bread wrapped in a towel. She knocked and I opened and the wind turned the towel into a sail. We both swore and laughed and then stood pressed to the heater, while she told me the gym still had power and the kids were bored enough to clean without being asked. Lena's the kind of person everyone assumes will be fine because she always is, and I hate that about what people do to capable women. But also, I've leaned on her steadiness more times than I can admit. I told her about the calls without adding the parts that would make me sound unglued. She listened with her head tilted and her eyebrows drawn together the way my sister does when she's ignoring everything except you. Then she said, "There was a classroom poster at the old place, the one upriver. My aunt used to talk about the poem on it. She said all the tape yellowed and still they'd stick it back up every fall. People remember what the wall said more than they remember each other sometimes." After she left, I called the troopers again, then used the satellite phone to call my brother in Kotzebue. It bounced twice and died. The third attempt made it through enough that I could say we were fine, and he could repeat the same with a half-second delay that made us both speak at once, and then stop, and then laugh. I didn't tell him about Annie. He'd tell me to sleep, and I'd hate him for being right. Before dawn, the station filled with a new sound, ice shifting along the window frame in small pops like distant knuckles. The radio stayed quiet except for a hiss like someone breathing through a scarf. I thought the storm was moving out. It wasn't. It was taking a breath. Night 4, the voices didn't ask for help. They told me stories. How the bell rope in the chapel wore smooth because too many boys felt braver standing there than sitting in the pews. How the school stove smoked no matter how gentle you set the damper. How the path between the two cut across a patch of tundra that held water all summer and ice all winter. And there'd always be one kid who took one step wrong and wet his boot and pretended he hadn't all day. How you could see the tower light when the sky was low and you were supposed to be home, and that blink would make you feel known. Even if no one was waiting with a light on behind their door, they used the present tense. I told myself it was an elder somewhere riding out the storm with grandkids and too much fear to admit they were safe enough, an uncle whose voice traveled funny over Skip, and who didn't know the trooper numbers to call. I kept my answers calm. I described where the clinic was set, how long it took to walk there in fresh snow where the drift built against the alley behind the store. I did not say, "You cannot see the tower from where you claim you are." I did not say that village is bones under snow. It would have been easier if there'd been any malice in their tone. But there wasn't. It was the careful politeness people use when they've spent too long learning to need each other. It's the voice you hear at potlucks and funerals. We saved you a plate. Take my place in line. I'll drop the girls home. It was that voice speaking through static, narrating small tasks. Now we wrap the elder's feet. Now we rub his chest. Now we sit shoulder to shoulder. At some point, the man said, "I could fix your knee if I were there. I've done worse repairs. Sit with the leg straight and wrap it warm and wait for the swelling to think better of itself." Night 5, the storm finally shifted enough that troopers out of Kotzebue got in the air. I reached them and explained, and the pilot made a noise only another operator would recognize. Equal parts sympathy and calculation. He asked for coordinates again. I told him what I'd been told the first night, and he said very gently, "There's nothing there. We'll sweep the coastline when we have visual. Keep the channel open." I suggested the myth out loud to someone for the first time. "What if it's the old settlement?" I said, knowing I sounded like the cousin who buys too much gear and then stays inside telling you how the trip would have gone. He said what anyone good would say. People get turned around. The old becomes the familiar thing you can aim for when there isn't anything else to aim for. Keep them calm and inside if you can. "We'll be overhead in 20. I kept them calm by not talking about it. I told stories of my own. The time my dad got a snow machine stuck in a drift he swore wasn't a drift. The time Lena made the 7th graders do a quiet contest so long, the principal came in thinking the room was empty. The time the tower light went out in October, and we all felt off until it blinked again like someone had turned the world back on. I mentioned without thinking the red hat. I took it off because my scalp had begun to itch. "Put it back on," Annie said, almost laughing. "You'll catch a headache." Then softer, "We can do longer than you think we can. We've done longer." The little boy's voice came back then, right in the middle of me telling the location of the spare blankets. "Mr. Radio," he said very seriously, "don't go outside when the light stops." "What light?" I asked. Because that's what my mother would have asked. And the word came out on a breath like I was pushing it into the wind. "The light in the window on your left," he said. "It makes a square on the snow when it blinks." I didn't look. I knew there was a window on the left. I knew the tower beacon flashed and the snow carried it like an echo. I kept my eyes on the radio as if the panel had answers etched in its brushed metal. "Okay," I said. "I won't." The storm clicked then, a sound so tiny I wouldn't have heard it in a larger place. A change in pressure, a hinge deciding it had been pushed enough. The heater fan faltered. The red AC fail light did not come on, because the generator was still happy. But the tone of the room shifted like someone had moved a piece of furniture behind me. The tower beacon, visible only as a pulse on the snow, did what it never does and stuttered. One blink. A longer dark. Another blink. A longer dark. "Don't go," the kid said, and I had the mad thought his mother would scold him for the tone if this were a real kitchen and I were visiting with coffee. "You'll get lost right away." I didn't go. Of all the bad decisions I've made, that wasn't one. I waited. The stutter corrected itself. The beacon went back to its metronome. The heater found its breath. I exhaled slowly and realized I had my shoulders hunched like I was waiting to take a blow. At 6 in the morning, the trooper crew finally came up on our frequency with a flat, steady voice that felt like a teacher. "We have visual," he said. "Town looks good from above. Roads are buried, but we see movement at the school. No signal or smoke out past the point. We'll loop inland. We still don't have anything where you marked earlier." He didn't say, "We told you so." He didn't say, "It's a ghost story and you fell for it." He said, "Stay on a clear channel. We'll hail you if we find anyone." The 6th night, the storm softened to a kind of white noise. You could hear the ocean again. You could hear the way empty spaces make their own sound. I was so tired I could feel sleep like a gravity. But there was a wired sweetness to it too. The way exhaustion convinces you you're special for still being upright. I started reading weather bulletins aloud to keep myself anchored to the real. Lena came by again and left a paper plate with 2 slices of pie covered in foil. The foil had written on it in Sharpie, "Stop forgetting to eat." After she left, I ate both pieces with my fingers like a child standing over the trash can, because I didn't want to wash a fork in station water that smelled like copper. At 2 a.m., the channel hiss raised itself a notch. Then there was no hiss at all. Just a thin hollow that made me think of cupping your hand over your mouth to whisper. "Nate," Annie said, using my name for the first time. I checked the log. I'd never used mine on air with them. Maybe I'd said it the way we say it to each other without noticing. "Hey, it's Nate," when you call a neighbor. My own memory betrayed me right then. I don't know for sure. She said, we can see the boy sleeping. Don't wake him. He needs to sleep. There was no boy in the station. The station had me and a heater and a thermos breathing steam through the open lid, and a pencil that had been sharpened down to a little soldier. I looked anyway. I always look like a reflex. The chair in the corner held the folded blanket I kept meaning to take home to wash. The candy jar held 3 sad peppermints. The kid's voice said, we're outside now. I stood very still. Laughter happens in storms. We've all laughed at wrong times because it's that or switch off. I didn't laugh. I said, keeping my voice a plain wall, do not come outside. I can't get to you. You need to shelter in place, Annie said, in the voice you use when you've already passed through panic and out the other side into something else. We are shelter. We've been shelter for 20 winters. We saw you when you were small. We saw you sneak out to look at the tower light when your mother told you not to. We saw you put pebbles in your pocket so you could throw them at the bell rope. I had once at a different place, different rope, same idea. I hadn't thought of the pebbles until she said it. My stomach made a tight little roll. I reached for the sat phone and then didn't pick it up because some part of me felt so singularly watched that moving would confirm something I didn't want confirmed. The mic clicked then without me touching it. It happens. There's a stick in the button that makes it grab sometimes, a little old plastic burr. I've sanded it. It still happens always when it's the last thing you want. The red light came on. The radio transmitted a clean, even breath. Inhale. Exhale. Catching at the top like someone worried they'd make too much noise if they breathed the way bodies prefer. I looked at the mic and knew what it would look like to someone on the other end. A room with no speech and a sound like someone trying not to be heard. Open the door, Annie said. Conversational, like we were neighbors and she was asking me to pass her a cup of sugar. We're between. That's all. The snow is lower near the back. The lock sticks. Turn it with your left hand. I'm not proud of the way my hand lifted before I told it not to. I am not proud of how much of me wanted to test it. To see if the door really would hang on the second turn and free on the third. To learn if the snow at the back was lower in the drift I hadn't cleared since Tuesday. The boy whispered. The way little kids do when they're worried, whispering is wrong and also the only correct volume. We will help you find the path, he said. We can see the square of light. I think of myself as reasonable. I also think of myself as susceptible to being told I'm brave and then doing something stupid to keep from disappointing a story I've told about myself. It's ugly to write it. It's uglier to live it. I didn't open the door, I talked instead. I talked like a person who believed the sound of their own voice could pull another person through a thing. I described the hall at the school with the mural where the paint peeled in scales because some contractor didn't know how to prime over old gloss. I described the way the clinic smelled like lemon cleaner and wet boots. I described the shelf above the station desk where someone once lined up 7 bottle caps in a neat row, and none of us had ever moved them. I said their names again, the ones they'd given me and the ones they'd never offered and I'd heard anyway. I said the word morning like it might convince time to hurry. The tower light blinked. The heater hummed. The mic stayed open, recording a breath I couldn't stop making even when I set it down on the desk and held my hands away like a suspect giving up. And then the voices did something I'm still not sure I understand. They began to narrate me. You're standing, the man said. You think standing makes you safer because you could move quicker if you needed to. Your right knee hurts. You'll say it's the weather. It's not the weather. You left the thermos open, Annie said. You'll forget to close it and think it was your mistake, and it was. Mr. Radio, the boy said very soft. You're crying. That's okay. I closed the thermos. I put my hands flat. The breath on the radio went shallow because I made it shallow. I whispered. If you're between and you can see me, then tell me what I wrote on the log at midnight. There was a pause long enough that I felt foolish for asking. I could hear the ocean again in that small way it has, a hush that moves like a cat in the next room. Then the man said gently, You wrote Annie, 5 souls? Between the church and the school. And then you rubbed it out until the paper fuzzed because the word souls made you feel like a bad person for writing a word only pastors use. I had rubbed it out. The eraser crumbs were still under my wrist. I pressed the transmit button and said nothing, because there wasn't anything left to say that would make sense to anyone except me, and whatever was doing its best to be people on the other end. I think I laughed a little, a dry sound that felt like a cough that had changed its mind. The storm was gentle toward dawn, and the sky had a light in it that wasn't sun and wasn't town. Troopers called and said, "Bright as birds, we're up, and we'll set down by the school, and you did good, Kivalina, and we'll be by the station after." I let the mic go. The breathing stopped. The red light blinked out. The heater ticked as it cooled even though I hadn't touched the thermostat. I waited. The boy said nothing. No one said anything. When they opened the station door at 10, the light laid a square on the floor that looked like every square of light I've ever loved in a winter morning. The trooper who came in first had that smell of cold that comes in on people who've been outside long enough that their coats have become weather instead of clothing. He said my name and I said his and then said his again to convince myself. He looked at the radio, then at me. He touched the mic with a knuckle so gentle you'd think it was a sleeping thing. "We got a weird report from the aviation guys," he said, like he was picking words from a shelf carefully. "They came in over the old site after all because we asked them to humor us. Nothing there. Just the same white as everywhere else. But they said at one pass they thought they saw footprints. Not fresh, just the wind making waves look like tracks. You know how it is." He looked at my face like he was measuring what story to tell me next. "You've been here all night?" "Yeah," I said. The mic was keyed when we came in, he added, like he couldn't help himself. We could hear breathing. Gave my partner a start. I looked at the mic. My hands had that tremor they get when I've had too much coffee and not enough food. The foil from Lena's note was crumpled by the trash can. The log lay open, the erased spot smudged. I felt all at once like the room was wider than it had been, like the station had stretched a half inch and kept it. They didn't find anyone. Of course they didn't. They did find, out at the edge of where the ocean pushed and pulled at the old ground, a piece of rotted wood with a nail still in it that some kid pocketed and got scolded for later, when it scratched him through his coat. Someone's dog refused to go near the spot where the path used to cut between two things that weren't there anymore. Lena swore she could hear song when she unlocked the school gym, and then laughed it off as the fan in the ceiling struggling to turn. The storm ended like all storms end. Not with a moment, but with 10 of them in a row that you don't notice until you do. The internet came back. People posted pictures of drifts like whales. Kids wrote their names in the newly plowed snowbanks. The tower light kept blinking, regular and dull and honest. I slept for 8 hours and woke with my knee still sore and my hands smelling like diesel. 2 weeks later, the station phone rang on an afternoon so still the sky felt like glass. A man down the coast wanted to know if anyone had reported hearing voices across the bands during the storms. He laughed once while he asked, like he didn't want to make a thing of it. I told him he wasn't the only one. He said they knew my wife's name and then changed the subject to the weather because there's only so much of your own story you can stand to say. In one day, I moved back to Anchorage in the spring because the job, I told myself I was coming back for finally had budget for me, and because my mother asked me for a Christmas where she didn't have to ship a sweater, as if it was medication. I rent a place near a hill that pretends it's a mountain if you squint. When the wind comes down, it sounds like a different animal than the one I knew. But some nights, the apartment creaks in a rhythm that maps onto the one-room station I still carry in my bones. I bought a cheap shortwave receiver at a pawn shop and set it on the shelf where most people put plants. It picks up more noise than voice. Every now and then, when the weather turns and the air tastes like metal the way it does before a storm, I spin the dial and the hiss changes into speech. I tell myself it's some ham tinkering with a homemade antenna, or a fishing boat with someone singing under their breath to stay awake. That's the sane answer, and the answer that keeps me from becoming a man who tells strangers at bus stops about the old chapel and the smooth bell rope. But 2 nights ago, with rain hitting the window so fine I didn't notice it until the sill felt damp, the radio picked up a thin voice that had traveled far. It sounded worn and proud the way people do when they've had practice outlasting. It said my name with a pause after, like a hand placed flat on the door before a knock. Then it said gently, "Don't get up. We can see the light. We're between." I didn't move. I didn't breathe the way bodies prefer. I stared at the square of streetlight on my floor and counted the blinks that weren't there. I told myself this was nothing. I told myself everything I always do and add this. There's a reason the last thing troopers heard on our station that 6th morning was a mic transmitting breath, steady and soft like a person sleeping in a room they think is safe. I don't know if that was me or something using my voice for a minute. I only know the radio on my shelf, 3 states away, Sometimes finds a washed-out space that sounds like people talking from a place that doesn't have walls anymore. If you live anywhere with a tower light, and you find yourself awake during a storm and the radio calls you by your name like it's known it all along, do me a favor. Don't go outside when the blinking stops. Don't open the door because a polite voice asks. Put your hands flat on something that hums and count to 20. If you feel foolish afterward, tell yourself it was weather. If you hear breathing and realize it's timed with yours, try to remember this one thing that might not be true and might be the truest thing I know. Some places don't let go. They stand between what was and what is, and if you talk long enough across that space, they learn your voice. They learn your hat. They learn the shape your breath makes when you're trying not to be heard. Right now, as I'm typing this, the receiver across the room is silent. The room is warm. The streetlight makes a square that sits on the rug and climbs the wall. I'm not going to look at it again. I'm not going to wait for it to blink. I'm just going to hit post and try to sleep with my hands flat, counting to 20, knowing that if I listen hard enough, I could pretend the hiss that rides under everything is only the ocean and not someone, somewhere, telling me the weather is changing and they can see my light. I used to roll my eyes at the dramatic posts on those scary forums, but I don't have anywhere else to put this. It's been a year, and the cold still shows up in my dreams like a patient animal. The only way I sleep is if I tell myself I've written the whole thing down. Maybe that's why I'm here now, typing with gloves on even though I'm inside, like it'll help keep the memory from sinking its teeth in deeper. I'm not a ranger or anything heroic. I'm a volunteer with a small search and rescue team that covers a lot of the Brooks Range in northern Alaska. In the winter, the world goes quiet in a way I can't describe to people who haven't heard it. The air feels like it has weight, like something invisible is pressing both hands on your ears. Most rescues are snow machine breakdowns or hunters pushing their luck at the edge of daylight. Every season, though, someone wanders where the maps end and the snow keeps secrets. It started with a message from Pete, our team lead. He's the kind of guy who says very little, and somehow still makes you feel like he's handed you a book to read. The text came at 5:22 a.m. on a Tuesday. Possible missing hiker, Anaktuvuk Pass, call me. I didn't even make coffee. I called him and listened to the hiss of his furnace through the phone while he talked. A local had reported seeing a man on a ridge west of the village, waving with both arms in the middle of a whiteout. That alone wasn't unheard of. People do strange things in bad weather. But the report had come in 4 hours after the storm sealed in the valley like a jar, and no one had seen anyone head out that way. The caller was a teacher named Angela, who'd moved up from Oregon last year. She sounded embarrassed but firm when I spoke to her later. I know what I saw, she kept saying. He was waving like he was trying to flag a ride on a highway. We assembled at the village hall because the school was hosting a basketball practice and the kids needed the space. The hall smelled like coffee and diesel, and felt warmer than it actually was because the plywood walls glowed with heat from the stoves. Along with Pete and me, there was my old friend Marcus. We'd started on SAR together and he still kept a picture of us on his fridge from our first training, where we looked like overstuffed marshmallows in our gear. And Mary, who'd been a flight nurse before moving north for reasons she never told. There were 2 younger volunteers I didn't know well yet, both cousins from the village, James and Eddie, who laughed quietly and said yes to everything. The weather was ugly, but not impossible. The wind used the streets like it owned them, flinging grit and snow that bit any exposed skin like salt. We checked our radios, extra batteries wrapped in wool socks inside our pockets to keep them warm, and I did the ritual I always do, pat down from left shoulder to right boot. Headlamp GPS, spare hand warmers and chemical glow sticks, reflective tape, spare goggles. I always reach the goggles twice because I'm terrified of ice buildup. You learn your own superstition up here. Before we left, Pete brought us into a little semicircle. No heroics, he said. We walk the markers and keep eyes on each other. If we lose line of sight, we stop. If someone says we're done, we're done. I want this clean. He had a way of making every mission sound like something we'd already survived. The wind hit us like a hallway fan turned to high. It flattened the fur on my hood and pushed the edges of sound down the back of my throat. There were no trees to speak of, just a suggestion of low brush and the skeletal shapes of snow fences along the road. The ridge where Angela said she'd seen the waving man was about 2 miles out, just a fold in the valley wall that barely looked like elevation when you stood next to it, but showed up on the topo, like a shallow breath. We moved in a line, spaced close enough to throw a glove and hit the person ahead. Every few minutes we slapped our thighs or flexed our fingers hard enough to hurt to keep the blood moving. Mary took point because she had the steadiest sense of direction I've ever seen in a person. A lot of us prefer the GPS, but Mary has a nose for terrain that doesn't lie. My face felt like it belonged to someone else by the end of the first quarter mile. I kept my right hand in my pocket a little too long between radio checks because the wind had become something you lean into and bargain with. We reached a drift that ran like a frozen river across our path, and everyone paused to step-kick footholds. The world shrank to a few feet for me, the circle of my headlamp and the gray cream of the air. The snow makes noise in a whiteout. It's not just wind. It has textures, little shivers of grain when it skates over crust, soft mouse sounds when it piles into itself. I kept thinking I heard something else under it, a tap or a whistle or maybe just a pattern my brain wanted to be words. When we got to the ridge, James gripped my sleeve and gestured with his chin. He had ice on his eyelashes that made him look like a child caught during a school pageant. "There," he said into the side of his neck warmer. "Do you see the—" "I see it," Marcus said. And his voice didn't sound like his voice, it sounded like a throat plucked like a string. There was a figure at the crest of the ridge about 40 yards off, standing on the lee side where the wind cut a little. The person had one arm raised, elbow bent, palm out like a wave frozen mid-air. My brain categorized it as quickly as it could. A person, a man, layered clothing, fur on the hood. The snow was pelting too hard to make out details, but the shape was wrong in a way that made me think of mannequins and unlit stores. Not wrong because it wasn't human. Wrong because it looked exactly human in a place where nothing stays that still. "Hey!" Pete shouted. He doesn't shout often. Sound doesn't carry here like it does elsewhere. It gets eaten and made dull. He held his hand up, palm out in the same shape without seeming to realize it. "We're SAR. Stay put." He didn't move toward the figure. He didn't need to tell us not to rush. Rushing in snow is how you fall into something that's not there. We moved along the line of the ridge to approach at a slight angle, the way you do when your depth perception is unreliable. The figure didn't change. The wind tattered the edge of their hood fur, but no other movement touched them. The closer we got, the more my brain tried to revise its understanding. I'd been expecting struggle or relief or at least life. What we found was the man Angela had described, but he wasn't waving anymore. He was frozen. Not the word people use when they mean very cold. I mean he was encased in a delicate crust of ice, rime that had built up on his clothes and lashes and the fine hairs visible on the back of his fingers. His arm was mid-wave, palm out, as if he'd been caught between hello and goodbye. His eyes were open. A pebble of snow hit his face and slid into the seam of his nostril without disturbing anything. His mouth was parted, a thin line of frost on his teeth. There was no color in him. Not even the faint yellow-blue of skin left too long outside. "Don't touch him," Mary said, and then softer because her own voice startled her. "Please don't." We didn't. It would have been easy to say we didn't because of respect for the dead, and that's true, but it was also because of something I'm not proud of. I didn't want to change anything about the scene because changing it would make it more real. I was already telling myself a story that maybe this made sense. Maybe the cold can do something we don't see. People get hypothermia and do strange things. They sit down and never get up. They take off their coats because their nerves are lying. Maybe he'd held his arm up and then, but no, not like that. Not with ice grown over each knuckle like a thin, clear glove. "Mark the coordinates," Pete said. He knelt to probe the snow around the man's boots, careful as a dentist. "We'll tag and call it in." That's when Marcus said, "Guys, in the way that means not just look, but look now." And he pointed down the ridge on the far side. There were more figures, 4 of them, spaced irregularly like the teeth of a comb. Each one had an arm raised in that same half-wave. Not posed the same way exactly. One had a little bend to the wrist, one had both hands up nearly shoulder level like he was trying to be seen by a passing plane. But it was the same gesture. Shapes coated in frost still. So still they felt like you shouldn't breathe around them. It looked like a photograph taken in a place God misfiled. I felt my stomach try to climb higher in my body. Is this a drift, some kind of drift thing? I asked no one and everyone. James kept blinking like he could clear the scene by clearing his eyes. Eddie crossed himself, a small, quick motion like he didn't want anyone to see. and then held his own hand up involuntarily, palm out, before noticing and stuffing it down into his armpit. We radioed the troopers, the village council, anybody who would listen, our teeth slurring our words. Protocol says you secure the scene and wait for law enforcement. Once you know you've got a body, it's easy to forget that most of SR is waiting with the clocks ticking somewhere else. We marked the coordinates, flagged a couple of willows with tape because visibility came and went like a curtain, and circled to see if any of the figures had identification. Mary did the impossible thing and stepped closest to the first in line. She put her face a few inches from his and then spoke into her muffler to me. "He's not who we train for," she said. "He isn't someone who was alive here 15 minutes ago." "What do you mean?" I was grateful for a task, even if it was just asking questions. "Look," she said, and she tapped the side of her head to tell me to use mine. "The rime isn't just on top of him. It's under the hood edge. It's pooled on the web between his fingers. That takes time and steady conditions, even in this wind. No one stands still like that unless they're already gone," I finished, and I immediately wanted to take the words back so they could float away and become part of the white noise too. We were still walking the line when the wind dropped for a breath, like the land had exhaled. In that tiny hush, I heard something that didn't sound like wind at all. It was a soft thud-thud, like someone patting an empty cardboard box. I turned toward the sound and saw the edge of a cornice above us crumble, no more dangerous than a shelf of dry snow breaking away from a porch. But the way the flakes fell made shapes, and the shapes looked like hands opening and closing. I told myself that was ridiculous even as I watched it. The snow hit the ground and didn't blow away, almost as if it had decided it liked the exact place it landed. Mary said without turning, "Do not wave back. Do you hear me? Don't mimic anything you see." I didn't think anyone was going to argue, but Marcus is the kind of man who tries to be funny even when he's scared. It's one of the reasons I like him, and one of the reasons I have almost punched him a dozen times. He lifted his hand, half playful and half serious, and held his palm up a few inches, then stopped like he'd hit a door. "Kidding," he said, seeing Mary's face. He dropped it. I wanted to say something like, "It's okay, we're sharing a nervous laugh." But the laugh didn't come, and the space where it would have been filled with the soft bite of the wind returning. The troopers told us over the radio to do what we were doing. "Mark, wait, keep a perimeter." A helicopter was grounded by the same storm we were standing in. Village elders came up on a snow machine with a sled and parked 100 yards back, where the snow fence broke the weather a little. I remember one of them, a woman with hair the color of caribou bone, nodding without expression when we explained. "People can travel in weather just like snow can," she said, not unkindly. I didn't know what she meant, but it lodged in the part of my brain that collects small pebbles for later. Night comes early there in January. It's not dramatic. It just slips the world into quieter clothes. The snow seems to glow with its own light even without stars, and your headlamp makes a tunnel that's at once protective and also like you are inside a straw. We took turns walking a slowly widening circle around the scene to make sure there weren't any other figures just outside of sight. Marcus and I went together for one sweep because we've always worked well in step. We kept up that SAR rhythm. Check on each other, comment on nothing, do the next right thing. On our second loop, I felt a soft flick on the back of my hood. I swung around, heart suddenly banging, and my light caught swirling snow like a handful of glitter tossed in a dark room. Nothing. Marcus had stopped too, his light making my shadow do a sudden lurch that made my stomach drop. "Don't," I said without thinking. "Don't what?" "Don't make shadows like that." I felt stupid, but I also felt like if I had to look at one more nearly human outline, I would do something I regretted. We were almost back to the others when the radio crackled so loud it made me jolt. Then a voice, thin and bent by the distance and the cold and the quality of the battery. "Movement south." "Is that you?" It was Pete, but the question wasn't meant for us. He was calling to someone in his eye line. Marcus and I turned in that direction, and there it was. A person standing just beyond the last figure in the line, half obscured by spindrift, face invisible under layered hoods and the kind of goggles that make a person look like a bug. The figure's arm was at its side, which felt more threatening than the others for reasons that don't translate well to words. There is an order to things, even strange things, and this broke it. "Hello," Pete called in that careful tone again. He took one step and then stopped. like he'd remembered the rule about no one going off alone. "Stay there. We're coming to you." The figure raised its arm as if to wave. It was a slow motion, a tired motion, the way you wave when your fingers have lost decision and you're hoping someone else will make the choice for you. It wasn't the clean, mannequin still hello of the frozen people on the hill. It was alive. I started forward before I could help it, and then felt Marcus's hand clamp on my pack strap and yank me backward with more force than I expected. "We move together," he said, and his breath made a quick burst of cloud in my headlamp. The figure waved again, and then, impossibly, a second figure moved behind it, sliding out of the drift as if it had been sleeping there. This one had its arm raised in the exact same position, fingers tipped slightly in the same casual way. If I were telling this to someone who didn't know the area, I'd say they stepped in sync. But the ground was uneven. The drifts were shaped by wind, and their movement was so eerily matched that all I could think was mirror. The second figure stopped a few feet behind the first. The first dropped its arm halfway and then lifted it again, a jittery repetition, and the second repeated the exact arc a half-second later. Mary said, right next to my ear, "Back up." When Mary says something like that, you don't ask for details. We took 3 steps backward and the snow squeaked under our boots like styrofoam rubbed together. The 2 figures did not advance. They adjusted. That's the best word I have. They shifted their arms, and then after a heartbeat delay, their bodies echoing each other. The first lifted its hand higher, the second copied it. The first took a half step. The second's foot rose at the same angle. Then both stopped, froze in place, and became as still as the line of statues on the ridge. The wind licked rime onto their coats in a way I swear you could see happen. A fine translucent cloud settling and deciding to be solid. "Eddie," Pete said without looking away from the pair, "get the village to pull back more. Everyone stays behind the fence. No one else up here unless they're us." His voice was the kind of soft you use when you're trying not to become prey. We stood there until my toes felt like stones, and my cheeks burned in weird, intermittent pulses as the blood tried to stay loyal. I thought I could hear a low whine under the wind then, like a power line. It wasn't mechanical. It was a tone you feel under your ribs. James murmured into his scarf, "They came when we came," and Mary said very simply, "No, we noticed them when we noticed them." I latched onto that like it was a rope thrown across a gap. Not everything you see in snow appears when you think. Sometimes light and wind cooperate to show you something that has been there a while, and you are only now worthy of its attention. We decided on the most boring plan. Hold the line, make ourselves visible without being stupid, wait for the weather to lift enough for the chopper. The troopers would take over. We'd give statements. I would go home and reheat something that didn't taste like it had slept in a plastic tub twice. That's how you keep moving, you imagine the after. But the snow does not care about your after. It cares about now, and now the storm decided it liked us more than before. The wind rose like an animal standing up, and the world folded down smaller around us. Headlamps hit only more white. The figures were screensaver images a dozen feet away, locked in place, arm up and arm matched. We tethered ourselves together because that's a thing we keep for the worst nights. A rope with knots every couple feet, clipped to each harness. So if one of us takes a misstep, the rest become a human deadweight that prevents a slide. I don't know when the whistle started. It could have been minutes. It could have been an hour. It was a sound like a bottleneck played by someone with cold hands. At first I thought it was the wind in an entrance to a burrow, but it moved. It orbited. And then somewhere to our right, just outside of what we could clearly see, a handful of snow slumped with a sigh, and a shape rose out of it. A shoulder, a hood, an arm lifting in that same slow, uncertain wave. A second later, to our left, a mirror answered. I felt the rope go tense between us as Eddie leaned back instinctively, pressing his heels into the crust and making a scrunching sound like someone tearing paper. Pete counted steady. 1, 2, step 1, 2, and we edged back toward our flags. The shapes didn't hurry. That was the worst part. If they had rushed us, I would have had something to push against. They just appeared and copied and became monuments to the motions we were trying not to make. At some point, Marcus, who had always kept the jokes like pepper, said quietly in my ear, "We shouldn't wave. We shouldn't reach. We shouldn't even nod." I could hear the handle of his carabiner ticking against his harness with his trembling. "Don't narrate," I said, which is what I say to him when I need him to stop externalizing the fear. He squeezed my arm through 3 layers with his mitten. "We have our own language after this many calls." The wind eased just enough for us to see the ridge again, and the line of frozen figures had grown. I know how that sounds. I don't know another way to say it. There had been 5. Now there were 7. The 2 at the end weren't as frosted. Their arms were raised, palms out, in the exact angle of that mid-wave that "I'm here if you are" look. I needed this to be a trick of light, a trick of my own counting. I started naming them in my head with numbers and nonsense just so that I could track them. 1 with the bent wrist, 2 with the heavy hood, 3 with the ice mustache, 4 with the... I stopped. The 4th had a patch on his sleeve like ours, the kind the village sews for us as a thank you. A little triangle with a snowflake and the coordinates of the pass. It was a gift. It wasn't mass-produced. Marcus saw it when I did. We didn't say a word, but I felt the rope between us go tight again. "Pete," Mary said in a tone that asked for permission and announced bad news at once. "We need to pull off the ridge. We're not adding answers here," he nodded. "Agreed, slow, we mark and we go." Helo in the morning light. He said it like morning was an actual thing you could order and not something that sometimes decided not to show up on time in winter. We backed away, every step curated like a museum display. I tried not to think about my own posture, about how often I lifted my hands to push a hood back or check a strap. I tucked my arms close and held them like a person holding a secret. The wind took pity and only shoved us instead of shoving and mocking. The elders on the snow machine were 2 hunched shapes that grew into generous human beings again as we reached them. They didn't ask questions. They handed us thermos lids of something that tasted like heat and roots and life, and I wanted to cry into mine. We bivvied in the village hall because no one felt right going home while it was going on. We used our own sleeping bags because the rule is you always prefer your own sweat to someone else's. Someone had laid out foil pans of moose stew on the folding tables under wool blankets to keep them warm, and the smell calmed me down enough to realize how exhausted I was. Then the radios kept us awake. Troopers checking in, weather updates, a helicopter ETA that bent every time the wind changed its mind. I caught a nap and woke up from a dream where I kept walking into a room and putting my hand up to flick a light switch and freezing in place before I could move it down. At 3:18 a.m., the wind made one of its strange, sudden fades. You can't count on them, but you can use them. Pete stood up and rolled his shoulders, a human crowbar coming back to life. "We go," he said, and nobody argued. The ridge in the early blue-gray of false morning looked like it had when we left it, only more quiet, if that's a thing. The line of figures had acquired a sheen in the stillness, like the air had decided to honor them with polish. The 2 at the end with the fresher frost were indistinguishable from the others now. I didn't let myself count again. The sound under everything was the soft, continuous settling that you get when the temperature drops a few more degrees and the world tightens. We did another slow perimeter. It was ritual by then, light step, stop, listen. I saw my breath, and for one long, awful second, I thought I saw it copied by something at the edge of vision. Then it was just spindrift, the same old trick of light and hope. When the chopper thumped in, it felt like a giant hand opening. The pilot sat down as close as he dared, and troopers in bright parkas did the things troopers do. Measured, photographed, muttered into mics. I watched their hands. None of them waved, not even in greeting. Everyone tucked their hands like we had. We were told to stand by in case they needed extra bodies to help move the dead. I braced myself for the weight. We've carried people out before with all the gentleness you can use on something that is beyond feeling. But when the troopers tried to shift the first figure, the one with the rime glove, something strange happened. His parka crackled like it had been sprayed with a fine mist and then frozen. It had. And instead of moving, the figure seemed to be part of the snow. The drift had accepted him the way concrete accepts a fence post that's been there long enough. It wasn't dramatic. There was no suction noise, no braking. There was just refusal. I saw the trooper's stance change as he adjusted, put his weight into it, and then give up. He looked up, face unreadable behind his buff. "We need to excavate, not lift," he said calmly. "We'll take them out as blocks." He said it like he was talking about geological samples because that helps. Language helps. It keeps you from saying the other thing out loud. We were sent to the far side to flag a path for the sleds. Marcus and I walked a little ahead, tape fluttering like tiny flames in our hands. We were careful. I was close enough to feel the roughness of the snow through my thick pants when I heard Marcus sigh. Not relief, not fear. The sigh you make when you are about to try something you know you shouldn't, like fitting a box that's almost too big onto a shelf. Don't, I said again, without any idea which don't I meant. He laughed under his breath, a sound you make into a pillow. I keep thinking about those tourists, you know, the ones who do the thing with the mirrors so it looks like you're standing next to 10 of yourself. I used to love those. He reached up to scratch at his cheek under his hood with the back of his mitten. It wasn't a wave. It wasn't even close. But he raised his arm. Put your hand down, I said, and there was more snap in it than I intended. He lowered it. We both watched the ridge. Nothing moved. Of course nothing moved. And then, out of the corner of my eye, in a shallow dip where the wind had laid a curl of snow like icing, there was the suggestion of a shoulder. I turned my head, slow like a wildlife video where you show the deer you aren't a threat. The dip was smooth. No shoulder. My breath sounded like cloth tearing in my own ears. The troopers worked. The elders waited. The cold got cleaner, which is a way I signal to myself that the temperature has dropped past a threshold that makes air taste like metal. The helicopter took the first block away, a coffin of snow with the shape of a man inside it, arm still up. Then the second, we watched like mourners. A woman in a trooper parka put a gloved hand on the block as it passed and then quickly removed it, as if touching had burned. We were packing up to leave. That phrase looks so casual here. What I mean is, we were choosing to step away from something that still didn't feel right. When the radio on my chest spat out two words that didn't make sense in context. Need help, a voice said, thin and familiar. Over here. The voice was Marcus's. I turned my head and saw him. He was 50 yards up the slope, not far, but far in a way that mattered. He was standing on a lip of snow that had drifted into a little stage. Half buried to the calf, one arm lifted, palm out. It was such a normal Marcus gesture. He waves like that when he sees me across a parking lot. Easy, like he knows I'll see him. But his posture was wrong. He was too straight. He was holding himself like people do in family photos when they are trying to be the tall one. The radio crackled again and I heard him say, but at the same time saw his mouth stay still. Over here. Marcus, I said into my mic, but the words fell out of me and died 2 feet away. Don't move. We're coming. He continued to hold his hand up. His breath fogged once in a thin line that didn't look like his breath had the last hour. It looked too fine, too sweet on the air. I started toward him and my rope went tight. Mary's hand on my line jerked me like a dog on a leash and I remembered the rule again. We moved together. We kept our eyes on him and took careful steps. The snow squeaked. The wind made little ballet bows out of spindrift at knee height. My headlamp drew a line from me to him and then to something behind him. Another shape was rising, following his posture exactly. I stopped. I don't know why. Maybe I mothered all at once. Maybe the part of me that loves him too much to let him be a lesson stood up inside me and said, No. I said, Marcus, put your hand down. Now. Nothing happened. Then his glove twitched. His hand lowered an inch, then another. The shadow behind him moved the same amount, a hair behind. He froze, his hand hovered halfway. The sound under the wind grew sweeter, like a bottle played with a wet finger. I kept my voice flat. Down, I said. My own arms ached from holding themselves so carefully. Down, down. He lowered his hand to his side. The shape behind him, I can't prove this part. The shape paused and then did not lower its hand. It kept its palm up. It held the gesture like a question. Then it took a half step closer to Marcus's back without disturbing the snow that should have been between them. The sound in the air got thinner. The hair on my neck tried to make itself taller under 3 layers of wool. Back to us, Pete said into the radio, not loud, not soft. No turns. Eyes forward. Backward steps. We're your mirror. Marcus took 1 step back, then another. His rope went tighter. I matched him as if we'd planned a dance. The shape behind him remained where it was. Arm up, palm out. A picture that would look like a friendly hello if you didn't know what hello meant there. We reached our flags and then the snow fence and then the sled. I didn't realize I'd been crying until my buff froze to my mouth and made breathing crackle. We flew out after the last block left. We gave statements. We drank things we didn't taste and slept like we'd been switched off. The troopers never found identification for all of the figures. One was a hunter from 2 winters over. Another had a wallet with a Seattle driver's license so warped by cold that you could barely make the state name. The rest were named by coordinates and descriptions. The official report used words like freak microclimate and ice accretion. Nobody wrote mirror. Nobody wrote hello. Marcus doesn't joke about snow anymore. He's still my friend. We still do calls together. But he wears his gloves in his house sometimes, and he turns his face when people wave so he can nod instead. Sometimes he texts me a picture of a frozen window and we don't comment on it. The elders at the village came to our after-action meeting and thanked us like we'd done something brave. The bone-haired woman touched my arm with 2 fingers and said, "You did not let yourself out." I said, "I don't understand," and she tilted her head. "Things come to see themselves," she said. "Out there sometimes you are what they see. It's summer now." I wrote this with a fan on and the window open, as if that matters. I still wake up with my arm half raised, palm out, a motion my body makes in sleep like it wants to be chosen. Last week, on a bright afternoon that had no business being frightening, I took my trash to the dump and a plastic bag got caught on a branch and flapped in a way that made my heart knock. It wasn't anything. I know that. Most days I know that. 2 days ago, I was at a 4-way stop in town and a kid on a bike lifted his hand to me without looking. Automatic courtesy. I lifted mine back and then stopped halfway, hand hanging in the air. The car behind me honked and I lowered it and drove on, feeling childish and silly. In my rearview mirror, the kid had put his hand down. The fluttering plastic bag at the edge of the lot had not. It looked like a small hand out of place, palm open, patient. Today it's gone. Or maybe I just didn't look long enough to notice it noticing me. I'm writing this now because sometimes when I close my eyes, I see a white hill and a row of people who might be people at all half buried, all mid-hello. And I see one among them, one that looks a little like Marcus's height, a little like the slope of my shoulder, a little like nothing I want to name. And I remember the sound the wind made when the figures appeared. Not a roar or a shriek, but a soft, eager whistle, like air pulled through teeth, like something practicing how to greet you without lips. I tell myself it's memory. I tell myself it's the brain keeping itself busy. I keep my hands in my pockets now when I walk past any open field, even in July. I keep my head down when children wave because I'm afraid of what will wave back where snow is a promise instead of weather. And on nights when I can't sleep, I dream of a light that never reaches the bottoms of the drifts and a morning where the helicopter never arrives. In the dream, I'm standing on a small rise outside the village, half buried, arm raised in a polite, helpless signal. My radio voice saying, "Over here," while my mouth stays closed. The valley pretends not to hear, and the snow, patient as ever, practices my shape until it knows me better than I know myself. I wake up with my hand on the wall, fingers splayed like I'm trying to wave my way back into my own room. I lower it and go to the window and convince myself the white at the curb is only leftover hail, not a calling card. You don't have to believe any of this. I know the words people say when they want to be kind and dismiss something at the same time. Microclimate, illusion, suggestion. I prefer them, honestly. They are warm words. If I could knit them into a hat, I would. But if you ever find yourself on a ridge in Anaktuvuk Pass and the wind eases for a second, and you think you see someone waving with both arms like they're trying to flag you down on a highway, don't wave back. Don't lift your hand for any reason at all. Don't even scratch your cheek. Tie your hands down if you have to. Walk away like you're backing out of a room where someone is sleeping. And if you see a figure the height of a friend, standing on a little stage of snow asking you with its stillness to notice it, if you hear your own voice on the radio while your mouth is shut, keep walking. Keep your hands in your pockets. The cold is patient. It will wait for you to say hello to yourself. I've learned to be rude. I hope you can be too.